Whenever I hear the name Ninja Gaiden, I used to think of this. Nowadays, I think of this. In 2004, Team Ninja, the studio behind titles such as Hyrule Warriors, Neo, and Metroid Other M, came out with a revered release, Ninja Gaiden on the original Xbox. Continuing the legacy of the NES trilogy, this 3D action revival of the IP lets you take control of Ryu Hayabusa on his quest for vengeance, and that quest is perhaps best known for being damn brutal. There's no denying it is, and the difficulty is certainly one of its core selling points, but I also think to remember it just for that would be pretty reductive. Not only was Ninja Gaiden 2004 impressive for its time, it still holds up well today, and if you're a fan of action games and haven't played this one yet, then what's wrong with you? Before we dive in though, I'm technically not reviewing NG04. You see, a year later, the game received an updated version, Ninja Gaiden Black, which includes DLC packs and some other tweaks and additions. I'm honestly not too familiar with all the differences between these two because it seems to be universally agreed upon that Black is superior, so I just play that. The 2004 original is basically irrelevant. Additionally, I'll be talking about Ninja Gaiden Sigma, which is yet another version of the game, released for the PlayStation 3 in 2007. Its changes are more sweeping and contentious, however, and I'll address these as we go, but considering Black is an Xbox exclusive and Sigma the one contained on the Ninja Gaiden Master Collection, it's worth covering both. Ninja Gaiden on the NES was a cool saga of side-scrolling action platformers. As Ryu, you could slash through enemies, use a variety of projectile weapons and magic spells, and climb ceilings and vertical surfaces. He was a fun character to play around with, and stringing together his various moves made you feel like a ninja. Much of this appeal has been carried over to NG04. Ryu cannot freely scale walls anymore since that would be broken in 3D, but he can still run up and along them for a brief period, and also jump off and between them. This is directly integrated into the combat. You can run along walls to evade attacks, run up one and jump off to get behind an enemy or deliver the smackdown from midair. Levels aren't just fancy-looking spaces you fight in here, they are environments you can interact with to approach fights from a variety of different angles. It gives Ninja Gaiden its own sort of combat flair, cause well, you tell me how many other action games allow you to do this shit. Of course, Ryu also has the more standard moves, regular slashes, attacks that launch enemies into the air, kicks that push them away, a guillotine throw, two different kinds of parries you can activate with correct timing, an assortment of aerial techniques, a stabbing death blow when foes are on the ground, etc., most of which can be followed up by one another effortlessly thanks to the fluidity of the overall combat. The quality of the animations is simply outstanding and holds up beautifully, and the effect and audio design are incredibly satisfying. Between the sounds of clashing blades, disgusting monsters getting ripped to shreds, the painful battle cries coming from Ryu when he performs physically demanding attacks, there's a real sense of feedback and weight to each connecting hit. The camera will sometimes zoom in briefly and elegantly to highlight flashy moves and finishers, and control-wise and mechanically, Ninja Gaiden is probably the most solid an action game had been up to that point. Every button is completely rebindable to your liking, not a feature to take for granted back then, and the camera is fully controllable. With the push of a button, it can be centered behind Ryu a la 3D Zelda if you need that instant correction, and Black added the ability to freely rotate and pan using the right analog stick on top of that. There's only what we now consider inverted handling in Black, so that sucks, but Sigma luckily has the option for non-inverted as well. To me, the proper third-person camera makes Ninja Gaiden feel inherently more modern to play compared to many of its contemporaries in the genre. There's no awkward fixed-angle shenanigans with shoddy depth perception or controls switching around on you, and I appreciate the largely consistent viewpoint on my surroundings. The camera is by no means perfect in cramped hallways or whatever, or sometimes when enemies are up close and I'm jumping off of walls and shit, it can feel a bit obstructed or if it's being operated by a drunk horse, and there's one specific complaint I have that I'll return to much later. Even still, the camera is more than workable, and combined with listening for audio cues, I can't say I found myself getting blindsided too often. Perhaps a little enemy radar at the bottom could have sealed the deal here, but I think the game's excellent defense mechanics already do a lot of the heavy lifting. In his blocking stance, Ryu actually protects himself against attacks from all sides. He doesn't have to be facing the right direction, and that really helps with potential off-screen ambushes that do happen. Moreover, you can dodge roll by blocking and flicking the analog stick, or even dodge jump by jumping during the roll. Since blocking and dodging are tied to the same button, you can always evade out of the blocking stance and also retaliate back into it after evading. I'm a big fan of this, as both blocking and dodging are defensive options you'll find yourself using constantly as a result, with neither slowing down the pace and flow of combat. Of course, you're not at all invincible, because enemies can do things to guard break or crush you, and another important detail not to overlook is your commitment to attacks. You can't just cancel out of them, so you gotta be sure about when and how you strike. Think Dark Souls or Monster Hunter, but less extreme. Now, with the speed of a game like Ninja Gaiden, having an engagement ring to your inputs may rustle your jimmies if you're very into your Bayonettas and Metal Gear Risings. Give it a chance though, and I think you'll be able to get accustomed. It's also more forgiving than you would assume initially, because you can hold down a block in the middle of your attack, and shit, you get hit by something, Ryu will skip the recovery frames that normally follow said attack and defend himself. It wouldn't be an excessive luxury if the game itself communicated this, but at least RZ's got y'all backed up. Lastly, the commitment also helps balance out Ryu's arsenal. The Vigorian Flail, for example, is way faster than a fucking unit like the Warhammer, but in exchange, it's not nearly as powerful. On the topic of weapons, I found myself switching between them more frequently than I would have expected. I'm sure the Dragon Sword, your all-rounder, is serviceable for just about anything, but when it comes to crowd control, for instance, I often find myself drawn to the Lunar Staff with its high speed and large range, and against bigger, slower enemies, or if I need to get in as much damage as possible in a short window, I'm typically pulling out something more hefty. Then there's the Unlabored Flawlessness, which can grow up to 200% stronger when Ryu is in critical condition. Not a blade you'll always want to use, but a fascinating one, with a risk-reward property that can really pay off if you're feeling confident. You'll notice it's otherwise basically a Wlaro with a few new attack strings, however, and similar similarities can be found in other weapons as well. I've only touched the nunchucks once since the Vigorian Flail seemed far better. The Kotetsu is like a weaker dragon sword that you can toss like a boomerang and drain health from foes with, so there isn't as much variety as the sheer number of them suggests. Still, I think there's enough to experiment with. Besides your melee equipment, there are a handful of secondary ranged gadgets that can assist you in a smaller fashion, from smoke bombs that temporarily blind your foes to explosive shurikens that stick to their target, and each of the different types of your main weapons, if you will, have their own decently extensive combo lists, no doubt a byproduct of the team's history with Dead or Alive, that you can even expand by leveling up the respective tool at the blacksmith. If you're on Sigma, you can also obtain the dual katanas, which play quite differently than a single sword, and the combo potential you can extract out of these babies is actually pretty sick. I was gonna point out Nimpo here too, but to say it adds depth would be an overstatement. Excluding the flame wheels that act as an offensive and defensive barrier, all the spells have Ryu anchored to the ground stress-free for a few seconds in order to let out some destructive elemental power. They can save your ass absolutely, but I think we can all agree that imaginative magic applications that properly change the dynamic of fights would have been more compelling. This segues us neatly into some of my gripes I have with the combat mechanics. The first of which is low-hanging fruit, but I'm gonna go there anyway. The game employs a loose automatic lock-on, and nitpicks notwithstanding, this works surprisingly well all things considered. Ninja Gaiden is very playable, however, from time to time, Ryu, he won't quite be on the same line of thinking as you. I believe he goes for whatever your control stick is pointing closest toward, which, especially when distance is involved, you can imagine, there's some room for error there. A theoretical solution would be a manual hard lock-on that you can toggle, but given the hectic pace of battle and the number of enemies that can swarm you, perhaps it wouldn't be super practical. Nonetheless, I recall situations where an option to override the soft lock-on could have come in handy, and otherwise an on-screen indicator to eliminate the guesswork of what our Gooba Ryu is aiming for would be an acceptable substitute. Let me tell you, this would be a godsend for Flying Swallow in particular. Instead of performing that, if you're slightly off his criteria, Ryu will do this slash to the ground which achieves fuck all battle if I'm honest, and that adds up to more than you think because Flying Swallow is one hell of a move. In fact, I'd argue to a fault. On higher difficulties, enemies are far better at dodging it, leaving you wide open way more, and some straight up counter and punish you if you're too keen on using it, but on normal, that shit's a fairly dominant strategy in a lot of cases. Watch like any playthrough of Ninja Gaiden and I rest my case. Many bosses, on the other hand, are programmed to just deny Flying Swallow at complete random, showing awareness from the developers at least, but this is obviously a poor method of addressing the problem. Not only does this create confusion, it also introduces a certain element of luck into the mix that has no business being there. They really ought to have balanced the move itself better, plain and simple. Attacking down from off of walls as well feels like too much of a cheese tactic. Again, past normal, enemies do make more of an effort to take you down, but generally speaking, it's kind of abusable. If you're in a dicey predicament or on the brink of death, odds are you could repeat this step over and over to carry yourself through to the other side and make a recovery. I'm not an actual designer though, so don't ask me how to go about fixing this one. I'm only here to bitch and moan about it. Alright, I promise, I'll let go off the balancing crap after the following, but charging essence, anyone? I think that also should have been tweaked. Whenever an enemy is defeated, they drop one of 3 colored orbs. Yellow, which is currency, blue, which is health, and red, which refills a Nimpo slot. You can choose to either pick them up or let Ryu absorb them by charging his weapon, allowing him, at the cost of the orb's original effect, to unleash an instant ultimate technique. Genuinely, it's a unique and interesting system that encourages on-the-fly decision-making. If you're low on health, for example, do you play it safe and heal, or do you go balls deep and out on the aggression? And the latter ain't free of risks. The charging animation takes a brief time to complete, so you have to position yourself carefully, and enemies need to be in close proximity for the attack to hit, so if you get disrupted or miss, you've just wasted the essence. In many ways, it is balanced, and I love the concept, but being able to chain these is a bit problematic in my opinion. With some skill, you can clear entire rooms of foes by absorbing orbs after one another, and it's often the most effective way too. There's no real penalty for it either, because the faster you kill and the higher your combo, the more yellow essence is rewarded. I'm probably treading dangerous waters now, like I'm hopping around submerged mines, but I really feel enemies touched with a UT shouldn't drop any more essence or something. It would increase the risk-reward factor further, and should you still choose to spam, at least there'd be a punishment in losing tons of currency. Clearly though, the developers were of a different mindset than I am entirely, because this BS is in fact encouraged through the game's ranking system based on karma points. Not only does performing UTs inherently grant you massive amounts of karma points, which makes no sense to me, successfully chaining them is, like I said, usually also the most efficient method of killing enemies, netting you even more points. I don't bother with the ranking system at all as a result, because it heavily pushes you towards a single repetitious style of play that I simply do not find fun. There's no debate for me that an approach such as Devil May Cry 3's, one which also takes item usage and the variety of moves and combos you pull off into account, is superior. In Ninja Gaiden, there is no extrinsic motivation not to chuck down potions, and I shake up my combat as much as I do because, well, that's how I enjoy myself the most. I suppose the silver lining here is that the ranks don't contribute to tangible benefits anyway. I mean, there's no yellow essence bonuses or unlockables or whatever. You can't even replay chapters individually, and there's no overview of your ranks to make it feel like you're working toward a goal. It strikes me as missed potential though, and sadly neither Black nor Sigma took the opportunity to tap into it. It's pretty lame too that some of the optional collectibles are missable forever, and to a certain extent, I think that diminishes the appeal of going for full completion. Again, a chapter selection could have solved this. They did a good job hiding the items though, the golden scarabs for instance, that you can trade in for a slew of different rewards at the blacksmith. I think tops I found about 45 out of the total 50, and I've never managed to max out my health or magic upgrades. If you want to shoot for 100% without a guide, it looks like you've got your work cut out for you, and I can always appreciate extra content like this. In general, the level design is not too shabby and worth talking about. It's kinda open and Metroidvania-esque, and often requires you to find items to open new sections and progress. In fact, the world as a whole is interconnected, so keys and other knickknacks you find in one area may be needed somewhere else entirely. The capital of the Vigor Empire then, Tyron, serves as a central hub of sorts that you'll frequently return to in order to access new stages or reach some of the earlier earlier ones if you feel so inclined. By extension, there are moments of mandatory backtracking, but I've never found any of it very bothersome. Half the time there will be new enemies along the way or secrets to find that you previously couldn't get to, and there are even a few unlockable shortcuts that further cut down on travel. It's fun to see how what starts as a large urban city where you feel a little lost on your initial visit morphs into a much smaller feeling place you're intricately familiar and comfortable with when all is said and done. Should you need it, there is a detailed map for every area in the game to aid in navigation, but I think it speaks to how well designed all the set pieces are that I never had any trouble getting around by myself. Yeah, I know, I'm pretty epic. I can visualize almost every square inch of the game and how they connect, and it helps that the stages are confined. You'll have to roam around them a bit to find the way forward, but it's never as daunting or with as much backtracking as an actual Metroidvania. Honestly, I kinda miss this era of action games boasting more elaborate world design. Among all the exploration, there are also puzzles to solve and platforming obstacles to overcome. These are probably the less impressive parts about Ninja Gaiden. Puzzles are few and far between, period. There's like one decent one where you move a bunch of platforms around an arena to climb to the top, and I would have liked some more, even if they only let the secrets or something. By contrast, the platforming is better and shows up semi-often, and I dig how non-intrusively hopping between walls is taught to the player. You'll run into a dead end in an alley, are simply told, practice makes wall running perfect, and that moment when the mechanic clicks and you get out through your own experimentation is satisfying. Regrettably though, past this, the platforming doesn't ramp up much. It's not very demanding in precision or timing. These rooms in the tombs with the swinging spike chains are probably the most complex setups, and perhaps that's for the best actually, because Ryu's jumping and parkour controls are, I don't know, finicky, unwieldy, they're passable, not as jank as in Devil May Cry 1, nothing as awful as hopping on the skulls in that game, but when fairly basic jumps and wall running segments prove to be a bit of a struggle now and then, I scream a little internally. Ideally, the platforming controls were smoother, also so that the developers could have created more elaborate challenges around them. All the same, I'm still happy with the overall structure. While combat is the richest and most polished gameplay aspect, chances are I'd grow fatigued if that's all I was doing. The other elements shake things up and it all comes together into a cohesive adventure. The puzzles and platforming may not be anything special, yet they're always brief enough that I do welcome them. I mean, hands up, who's gonna say no to an Indiana Jones boulder chase right before you fight hordes of zombies in the depths of a catacomb? The only nonsense I'd have gladly seen removed is the swimming. It's slow, dull, and of course we have like a 15-minute long chapter dedicated to it. It's a pace breaker, this one, and I'm honestly a bit baffled as to how such a seemingly forward-thinking studio like Team Ninja considered this in any way not garbage. To give credit where it's due, Sigma does streamline this chapter a fair amount. It's shorter, especially if you ignore optional junk, there are actually hazards to dodge while underwater, and they added some on-land combat that was absent in Black. It remains one of my least favorite sections, but is more tolerable to replay here. However, this is what's so funky about Sigma. For every arguably good change it makes an arguably bad one to offset. In an effort to cut fat, I suppose, it throws out or simplifies multiple rooms of content that I think were totally fine. But in Chapter 2, for instance, it turns the village burning sequence, merely a cutscene in Black, into something playable with the boss battle at the end. I'd say that's an improvement and a graceful, natural way of extending the level, recontextualizing a key event in a more interactive manner. Then, on the flip side again, Sigma contains 3 chapters where you play as Rachel, which is not as hot as it looks because they're basically truncated versions of Ryu stages. Plus, Rachel herself has limited capabilities in interacting with walls, can only use her warhammer with no access to a lighter weight weapon, and doesn't have many notable abilities of her own. Case in point, she's a watered-down, less versatile Ryu, and so her segments come across as filler. She gets one unique boss encounter, and that's all she wrote. This stuff should have been optional, so you aren't forced to break away from Ryu on every single playthrough. And listen, there are more alterations from Black to Sigma we haven't gone over, but I'll leave the full rabbit hole to go down for that remake or rebreak guy. Bottom line, the two trade blows for superior release, and how that averages out is pretty subjective. I'd be remiss not to mention Sigma does also add a few extra checkpoints and shops, but this doesn't have much of an impact on the overall experience if you ask me. You're still getting most of the same challenge as in Black. And this is vital because the challenge is of course integral to Ninja Gaiden. Even if I did complain before about some of the moves being a bit OP, it's not so blatant that it cripples everything. If you're new to the game, then be prepared to kick the bucket regardless. A lot of this boils down to the enemy design. The enemies are aggressive and simply relentless in their pursuit to make you a dead man. They will come rushing toward you, shoot or throw shit at you, grab you if you don't keep moving, and more often than not, you're dealing with a group. In Chapter 2, for instance, you take on samurais while a magician is constantly teleporting around and blasting projectiles your way. You gotta pay attention to each of these threats, anticipate and time your dodges around the projectiles, as you are also trying to crush the samurai's defenses and get rid of them. Managing these kinds of situations, defending yourself, and finding opportunities to sneak in damage or a combo is the name of the game, and it's an exhilarating one because one wrong move can easily cost you a ton of health or your life completely. If you get reckless, if you don't properly learn from your mistakes and study enemy behavior and telegraphs, you're going to continually bite the dust and run into that game over screen. These are the cold facts, but I want to stress this is not some obscenely hard Kaizo that you should be too scared of touching. Sure, you'll want to rip off your pubic hair with a roll of duct tape on like very hard and Master Ninja difficulties, but on normal it's reasonable. Tough, but reasonable. There's a good amount of elixirs dispersed among the world, and a shop is almost always accessible in any given chapter where you can buy more supplies should you run out. There are no lives to speak of, and while checkpoints can certainly be far apart to ratchet up the tension, the vast majority of bosses have one right around the corner. You won't be getting sent back 3 stages here when dying once in a 3-part long final boss, that's for sure. Enemy placement is well thought out too, and there's no dumbass knockback that'll have you careening into pits. By and large, I think NGO4 is fair no matter the difficulty setting, and any player halfway decent at action titles should be able to finish it on normal with persistence. That's not to say there won't be anything that'll get on your nerves or feel a bit cheap. For me, a big one is the aforementioned enemy grabs. A lot of them are unbreakable and not telegraphed, which I don't mind inherently since you're a ninja and you shouldn't stand still for too long. However, once in a while I happen to land in front of somebody and they insta-grab me with nothing I could have really done about it. It's not frequent enough to be a serious issue, but I do wish the AI was tweaked to make grabs more reliably avoidable, or that you could maybe break out of them in some way if you're quick and skilled enough. Perhaps you're expecting me to rant about the ghost fish here as well, but for as notorious as they are, I'd expect worse. These bastards bite onto Ryu and have you button mash to escape their grip. They can be pretty fucking annoying if you don't have a strategy for them, but you're also told outright what weapon to use against them. As such, I don't find the ghost fish so much frustrating as I find them uninteresting, because once you figured out the trick, they become a non-threat basically. On that note, there are some other enemies I'm not too fond of fighting for similar reasons, mostly the bigger ones. It just kinda becomes a game of backing off, waiting for a safe opening window to punish, and repeating the cycle. They do make for contrast compared to all the hectic mayhem, but I usually feel compelled to skip past them when I can. I think these larger enemies work best in packs or when they cooperate with the nimble smaller ones, because taking down anything becomes more involved and complex when you have multiple threats to contend with at the same time. The positive news is, much of the game focuses on the type of high-speed, frantic combat scenarios I prefer, and there's a healthy variety in terms of enemies there. Even better, higher difficulties will pit you against new or upgraded opponents not previously seen. For example, among others, Hard introduces these deadly gray cats that love to swing around your neck, and the cyborg dudes with hardened defenses, carrying weapons ranging from lightsabers to grenade launchers. No idea what high-tech robot police are doing in a Middle Eastern town, but okay. Next to enemy types, enemy arrangements are also mixed up substantially. The toughest white ninjas at the end of Chapter 1 on normal are merely a common foe on very hard, and often accompanied by the even more dangerous purple samurais, and where you previously may have faced a very small group of already tricky black ninjas, now there might be a short wave of black cats that are even more evasive than the gray ones, along with the orange ninjas who dish out significantly more pain. These sorts of changes are all over and make each scale up in difficulty mode a relatively fresh affair. They aren't only modifying damage dealt and received and limiting the resources you can carry, and I really admire that. Special shoutouts here to Ryu's Fiend Doppelganger, who shows up from hard onward. His AI is relentless, and as such, he'll provide you with straight one-on-one slugfests. These are truly not over until they're over, but all the same, I find them fair because any unexpected harsh stunt he pulls on you, 9 times out of 10 you can perform the exact same on him. The arenas are pretty open and elaborate as well, so you've got a lot of space to operate in and potentially use to your advantage. It feels awesome when you're doing well and nailing the moves, almost like you're playing out a ninja movie. That said, screw that one encounter where he's using the Vigorian flail. He can bullshit combo your ass in the air and zap loads of health with no chance to break free, yet no matter how much I tried, I couldn't do the same on him. It kinda ruins this fight specifically, not gonna lie. By far the most questionable aspect of the higher difficulties to me, however, is the addition of minions to boss battles. In concept, I think it's very cool, but the camera is not equipped to handle it half the time and should have been overhauled to accommodate. Sometimes, the minions can be so swift on their feet and all over the place, and the game is so concerned with keeping the boss dead center in frame that the whole shebang becomes a clusterfuck. This is the most recurring camera struggle I've faced. I've outright died from it on multiple occasions, and was even robbed of a priceless W by some off-screen surprise attack. This battle saw me climbing back with the odds well stacked against me. I really activated my gamer mode here, so I deserved better, damn it. Thankfully, in other instances, you get a wider shot that allows you to reasonably oversee everything, or maybe you don't always, but the minions at least remain stationary. Situations like these are fine and seem to properly realize what the developers were going for. The best example is the Chapter 2 boss. You're on a straight bridge with a loose camera you can quickly flick either direction, and the minions merely warp around and shoot projectiles. There's multiple approaches you can take, from solely focusing on main horse dude to getting rid of the minions immediately whenever they spawn, and you've got both the sword and arrows at your disposal to get the job done. To me, the encounter is so great that it rises above any jank it may have. Fortunately, I actually like many of the bosses on their own. Unless you plan to potion scum, you cannot just wail on them and expect victory through sheer brute force and luck. Many of them will block your attacks and or severely damage you if you get too close and don't know what you're doing. Whenever you encounter a new boss, your first order of business is carefully observing all their patterns and moves, and possibly how their AI reacts when you approach them. In doing so, you'll learn to gauge and intuit the best way and time to strike, eventually to a point you can get through with minimal to no item use. I remember getting game overs embarrassingly often against the likes of Dynamo and Doku on my first playthrough, whereas now I can beat them pretty consistently on most difficulties without opening the pause menu once. I sorta dogged on fighting larger enemies even though they have parallels with the bosses, but I'm ultimately more engaged with the latter because 1, you typically only run into them once or maybe a second time with the twist, and 2, there's more complexity to them. The road to mastery is more engaging and rewarding as a result. Now, I also gotta be realistic, so I'm not gonna sit here and pretend all the bosses are spectacular. There are ones of lesser quality too. Simon Says 200-inch penis monsters, anybody? They're pathetically easy to read, and for no discernible reason, Team Ninja thought it was necessary to have 3 variations of this same boring concept, as if 2 wasn't sufficient. There are also the tank and helicopter showdowns at the military supply base, which revolve around avoiding repeated cycles of machine guns and rocket launchers, sneaking in hits using the bow, and maintaining your ammo. They're really simplistic in nature, but not bad or even pushovers necessarily, and since they're followed up by one another, I think they at least make for a fun pair of memorable set pieces. To cut to the chase though, if I had to nail down my most disliked boss, it has to be Awakened Elma, which is ironic. Normal Elma is one of my favorites, because while she is unhinged and unforgiving, all her tricks are reliably dodgeable with correct positioning and foresight, and I was able to derive a few strategies I could switch between to damage her with decent consistency. The outcome is a mighty intense tug-of-war endurance battle that requires your A-game more than any other boss. Awakened Elma, on the other hand, has a projectile attack that I swear is impossible to circumvent sometimes, and if there is a method to hit her without taking damage, then fuck me sideways, because I couldn't figure out a single one for the life of me. As far as I can tell, Flying Swallow is your only bet, and that's terrible if you recall the lottery that is landing the thing. I hate Awakened Elma. That being said, on the whole, the bosses get my approval, and if you want to tackle them in a variety of remixed ways, the unlockable mission mode is something you should check out. In there, bosses can be grouped with some of the most dangerous enemies, or put in a different setting altogether that changes how you approach them. The military tank in the middle of the streets of Tyron that can barely house it, for example, and towards the end they even start teaming up. This was X-Challenge before X-Challenge. The poor camera has no clue what to do with itself, but I can't deny its endearing as off-the-wall lunacy for the dedicated masochists. Not only that, mission mode also has a surplus of common enemy gauntlets, and the difficulty for all of this is significantly higher than the regular game. Not all the missions are noteworthy, but it's quite a beefy mode with 50 pieces in total, and there's enough good to see most of it through. They clearly put effort into this, it's not some mindless shallow bonus content. From what I've sampled, Sigma even replaces about half of the missions with new ones, so who knows what other magnificent sauce is lurking behind all these question marks. I know, shame on me for not finishing all 50 of them again, but I've got better things to do after recording like 60 hours of gameplay for this game. Let me off the hook, man. I hope this goes to show, though, that while the ranking system blows and won't have you coming back for more, between the substantially altered difficulties and now mission mode, there's plenty of replay value and stuff to sink your teeth into. Ninja Gaiden is a meaty package and feels like a fully developed AAA title. The main adventure clocks in at roughly twice as long as Devil May Cry 1 for reference, and it's evident a lot of care and attention went into the production. Not only in terms of gameplay, but the graphics are also some of the most, if not the most, technically accomplished for that era. As somebody who grew up on PS2 and GameCube, goddamn, I am kinda floored by how impressive this game looks on Xbox. Barring the 480p resolution, I could have mistaken it for an early 360 release. It's crazy out here. When put next to Metroid Prime or Resident Evil 4, both of which are often praised for their state-of-the-art visuals, it's evident that Ninja Gaiden and the power of the original Xbox are a step above. Character models are simply top-notch, textures still look fairly sharp and detailed, the effects and particle work are amazing, and what stood out to me the most are the slick reflections in marbled floors, streams of water, and the like. All of this is achieved in widescreen that properly extends the field of view rather than crop the top and bottom, and at an uncompromised, near-flawless 60 frames per second. You'll encounter bouts of slowdown and a bit of screen tearing here and there, but it's minimal in the grand scheme of things and easy to forgive, considering the game hardly ever needs to load in the middle of a chapter. It's phenomenal, really, but I also think it's fair to say that most people, including myself, will gravitate more towards Sigma here because it's noticeably more colorful with deeper contrasts, giving the visuals that last push they needed to look truly pleasant and almost timeless, I feel. And it's safe to assume the Xbox was not a limitation in this, was it? Seems like an artistic choice more than anything. Though obviously, as you'd expect, there are technical enhancements as well. Higher resolution textures, some nice extra flourishes like the leaves falling down in Chapter 1, a moderate amount of bloom lighting that doesn't overpower the image, yada yada yada. The PS3 version also renders at a full native 1280 by 720p and even manages to maintain a pretty stable 60 FPS, albeit again with the occasional screen tearing. As a result, I'd say Sigma has aged pretty darn well by 360 and PS3 standards. There are more load points than on Xbox and they're longer to begin with, even with data installed to the hard drive, which is kind of regrettable, but not too bad given how short and infrequent loading used to be. That said, the biggest problem I found is that the game tends to skip sometimes, particularly during cutscenes.
You're much more powerful than just a human.
My strength comes from training, not from some curse in my blood.
Are you so sure of that?
It's very strange and kind of a blemish to be honest, but I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker. What is a deal breaker is that Sigma fucking ruins the music. Actually, it's another mixed bag. Yeah, so Sigma changes the music here and there and it's hit or miss. Some of the replacement tracks I took to a little more. Others, I think, are better originally in black. Like geez, a little in your face for the first two enemies, don't you think? But much like the games themselves, it's not a huge deal either way. A great chunk of the soundtrack is left untouched in the first place, and speaking of that soundtrack, it's a solid selection. I do believe there are memorable tunes here and a handful of real standouts. The Rockin' Military one I used at the start of the video is certainly one of the highlights, and furthermore, there's Pray to God. Alma Awakened, and Under Alert. Bear in mind, those aren't the only tracks I enjoyed by a long shot, but let's not drag out the video with 30 minutes of music, shall we? It's a well-rounded score that can be action-packed, atmospheric, or even pretty somber and melancholy when appropriate. Just look at this scene, and I think the background piece perfectly conveys and supports the context of what's going on. What I find to be a shame then is that I can feel the emotional weight in this music, but the story itself doesn't really hit. Plot-wise, Ryu's home village is raided by a force seeking the Dark Dragon Blade, an evil blade with the potential to cause endless death and suffering. This blade lay dormant under the protection of the Hayabusa clan, and as it gets stolen and most of the town is burned down, Ryu has one simple goal: retrieve the Dark Dragon Blade and avenge his murdered clan. It's an effective setup on paper, however, as the player, I have no established connection to Ryu's people. You never see what the village and its folks were like before destruction, lessening the impact of the scenes that involve the village, and by extension making the surrounding journey feel not as personal to the player. Now perhaps establishing that connection would have made the game's opening too slow, which is fair enough, but then my problem is Ryu himself. He does have an attachment to, and I presume, memories of all the people he lost, so if we could empathize with him and his inner turmoil, that would go a long way already. Sadly, we're shit out of luck there too, because Ryu is a very stoic and self-serious man. Evidently, something must be driving him, and you can see the hatred in his eyes whenever the name Doku, the leader of the attack on his home, is mentioned.
I'm looking for a greater fiend named Doku. Do you know him?
Why are you looking for him?
I'm going to kill him.
That's the most you'll ever get from him though. I mean, I get it, he's a cold, calculated ninja and it was clearly intentional, but nevertheless, it's hard to feel invested in somebody who displays less emotion than my boy King K on streams. Doesn't help that Ryu's got no charisma or much of any personality on the whole, making him kinda boring compared to most other action game protagonists that bring their own unique energy to the table. Surely they could have injected some character and vulnerability into this guy without taking away from his badass stature. If you've played the NES trilogy, you'd also know Ryu was more expressive there, so I'm not sure why Team Ninja didn't stay more true to that. As weird as it sounds, I think Rachel is actually more interesting between the two. One could argue it's just my dick convincing me of that, but I will not entertain this idea. Rachel is more inclined to share her pain and motivation with Ryu, that being that she became a hunter to kill her sister, Alma, who was cursed into a monster. Alma is also a boss you fight, so all that combined, it's easier to relate to Rachel, and she's visibly upset not only in the way she talks about Alma, but also when she can't bring herself to kill Alma when the opportunity finally presents itself. See, I'm not as superficial as you think. Goofs and gaffs aside, Rachel isn't even a deep character and doesn't get as much screen time as I would have liked to develop her further, because she frequently gets her ass beat and kidnapped, so the fact I want to say I cared about her and Alma the most is a little telling. Due to Ryu's demeanor, there's no sense of chemistry between him and Rachel either. Seriously, they have less of it than Ratchet & Clank do in the PS4 game.
He led her down the path of evil, and she succumbed. Fiends are pitiful beings, destined to live forever, slaves to the forces of evil. And there's only one way to release them.
To kill them.
Alright, I couldn't even say that with a straight face. Still, even at the very end, when the day has been saved and the sun rises, Ryu just ignores Rachel's concerns and affection, goes, "It's over," and leaves? Truly, few fucks were given here, and speaking of the very end, I gotta say, the game goes out on a whimper. You see, I quite like Doku as a villain. He's got a wicked design for starters, with that burning blue flame for a face behind the mask. Simply oozes mystique, and he leaves an intimidating impression when he beheads members of the Hayabusa clan and kills Ryu during the invasion. At least that's sure what it looks like, but the very next chapter, Ryu is all up and ready for revenge. Is he like Dante, that he can be pierced by a sword and just wring his body out of it? Regardless, you also learn later on that Doku is the one responsible for cursing Alma. Ryu is warned on multiple accounts not to mess with him, and so there's real build-up to their inevitable re-encounter. Classic setup and payoff. The thing is, Doku isn't the main antagonist. He's only the servant of an evil god monster, the Vigour Emperor. A typical trope, you're taking on the ancient evil after overcoming everything else, and I can see the appeal. It's just, to me, abstract entities that want to become supreme deities because, of course, often feel random and uninspired. Look, I beat Doku and there's a sense of satisfaction when finally killing that punk. I beat the Vigour Emperor and I'm about as enthused as Ryu himself. I'd probably have preferred if they further fleshed out Doku with maybe a compelling background and purpose. And you know, this is something I could overlook, but then I got to the final boss and just... no. Over the course of the adventure, there's a few cutscenes where this mysterious man with a cape and his advisor Gammoth are expressing their desire to obtain the Dark Dragon Sword. After defeating the Vigour Emperor, this cape man is revealed to be Murai, Ryu's late uncle you trained against in Chapter 1. While that sounds like a juicy twist, it frankly wasn't impactful at all. In retrospect, the foreshadowing is certainly there, so it doesn't come completely out of left field, yet it feels like it does all the same, because you last saw Murai in Chapter 2 and have probably forgotten he even exists. Furthermore, you would think Murai and Ryu would have some words to exchange with one another, considering how close they are, to heighten the tension and create an epic climax and all that. But no, instead, Murai doesn't explain anything, Ryu doesn't ask anything, and once the battle is over, Murai falls into an abyss and Ryu doesn't seem to reflect on it in the slightest. The whole affair just kinda happens and rings hollow as a result, which is so disappointing. I'll give him this though, Murai obliterating Gammoth for no real reason other than to be a dick is pretty based at least.
You've done well, Gammoth.
Anyway, had Murai played a more significant role throughout the story, I have no doubt the twist that he's been manipulating you all along for his own pursuit of power would have landed a lot better, not to mention the finale of the game would not have felt as forgettable and slapdash as it does. That's how I'd sum up the story as a whole really, promising ideas with potential lackluster execution. Maybe I'm in the minority for even caring. This is a tough-as-nails action game where the gameplay is most important, right? But remember, Ninja Gaiden on the NES was pushing boundaries here. Cutscenes are highly cinematic for the platform, and the stories, though obviously basic when viewed through a modern lens, have more depth to them than almost any contemporary that isn't an RPG or something. For their time, they were remarkable. It's clear NGO4 still put the same effort into its presentation, and there's almost an hour's worth of cutscenes. Both in-engine and pre-rendered, the animation is great by 2004 standards, and the English dialogue is properly lip-synced, which is commendable considering that's still not always the case for Japanese-developed titles even today. It's just a bummer the actual content and substance of the cutscenes doesn't live up to this presentation. I know for me personally, a strong story can definitely elevate a game further and give it more of a lasting impression. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why something like Devil May Cry 3, featuring characters with actual character, quotable dialogue, and memorable cutscenes, is still remembered so fondly by the masses, whereas Ninja Gaiden merely has a small cult following these days, despite selling very well and receiving critical acclaim across all three of its releases. And putting aside my story critiques, earned those sales and reception, I'd say it did. Ninja Gaiden was undeniably ahead of the curve in terms of mechanics, and you can't help but respect what Team Ninja managed to accomplish here. The combat remains smooth, fast, visceral, and the overall experience is nicely paced with solid level design and exploration. There are flaws, a couple of aspects newer players might find dated, and a few weaker sections, so I wouldn't go into Ninja Gaiden expecting still the best action game ever made, but if you're a fan of the genre or simply itching for a challenge, I can only recommend checking it out. Black or Sigma, I think both are perfectly fine choices. Black is a bit tighter since there's no Rachel chapters and as such, probably my go-to, but Sigma's got the more attractive looks and the other small ways in which it's inferior are mostly details only the hardcore seem very bothered by. Basically, get whatever version is most convenient for you and enjoy a classic, because Ninja Gaiden is easily one of the best titles of the original Xbox library. Then came the sequel. Oh, okay, that's a bit of a change of pace. Released in 2008 for the Xbox 360, Ninja Gaiden 2 is like its predecessor, only 10 times more chaotic and 10 times as bonkers. So much so actually that it exploits specific strengths of the 360 hardware, and that its port to the PlayStation 3 a year later, Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2, had to have parts of the gameplay toned down to work. That said, there are many design changes even beyond that, and in contrast to the Black and Sigma editions of the first title, all these alterations make for two radically different experiences. Rest assured though, we're covering both Ninja Gaiden 2 and Sigma 2 all the same, and just for clarity, Vanilla 2 has a gold UI at the top, while Sigma 2 has a silver one. To start with the basics, however, the mechanics are largely the same between both versions, and the core should be instantly familiar to you if you've played Game 1. The controls and many of the animations, from wall running to various attacks and combos, have carried over basically note for note, and feel as excellent as ever, which is not to say changes haven't been made, quite the contrary actually. Overall gameplay speed is a bit faster in a good way. Ryu's dodge roll is replaced by a quicker dash, for example. Instead of casually walking through doors, he karate kicks right through them now. Climbing ropes and bars is sped up significantly, and that's much appreciated because it shows up more often here. You can adjust the rotation speed of the camera to your liking, which used to be a tad slow, and the visual and audio feedback for hitting and destroying enemies is some of the most cathartic shit ever. Team Ninja saw what the stronger hardware was capable of and took full advantage. The sheer pizzazz of effects and particles is next level. Just compare an ultimate technique charge from Ninja Gaiden 1 to now to get the picture for that, and the gore is cranked up to 11 in Vanilla 2. Blood and other juices splatter all over the place there, dead bodies and innards remain on the floor for quite some time, all of which is reduced in Sigma 2, sadly. Whether this was an effort to censor the game or to optimize performance for the PS3, the Lord knows really, but instead we get this dissipating mist, which is fine enough, but the impact does feel a little lesser. What remains intact, however, is the new dismemberment system. In the first game, heads would sometimes fly off when enemies die, entirely for flair really, but in the sequel, Ryu can also, I think at random, slice off their arms and legs. This obviously handicaps the opponent, but they'll continue to pose a threat. After all, you don't need arms to continue fighting, right? And dudes without legs may even crawl toward you in an attempt to suicide bomb on you. Some foes can even pick up body parts from their fallen allies and toss them at you. Everybody's out for the Dragon Ninja's fucking blood. Now, where the benefit for the player comes in is that you can instantly execute delimbed enemies, do a heavy attack when close to them, and Ryu will perform one of his many vicious obliteration techniques. These are simply brutal and one of the things that truly make you feel like an unstoppable murder machine, plowing through forces of evil with the staple swift yet slick camera cuts and zooms to add that final bit of bite. The importance of getting these details right in an action title cannot be overstated, and Team Ninja demonstrates a mastery of this craft. I don't want to think about the amount of work that must have gone into all the animation on display. Granted, a decent chunk of it is reused, but there's also so much new. The returning ultimate techniques are the star of the show in this regard. They were already cool in the previous title, but man did they get an upgrade. They're unbelievably ridiculous and over the top, and each weapon of course gets its own unique variant, or sometimes even two. Just check out this fully charged one for the true Dragon Sword. If that's not sick to you, then I don't know what is. Yup, we're still going. Okay, we're finally done. Unfortunately, for as impressive as the UTs are, they do get kind of old after a while. Essence charges have not been reworked at all from last time, so there's still the same issue of being able to chain them one after another, and since they are about twice as long on average now, repeating them too often can start feeling more like you're watching Ryu rather than playing him. To clarify, I love the concept of essence charging, I really do, but to me, UTs are supposed to be your ultra super moves. They should be balanced as such, to limit the possibility of or otherwise disincentivize constant spamming, and to add real tension and consequence to the decision every time. There has to be a way to achieve that, right? And the sheer spectacle would also be all the sweeter and more earned if the UTs didn't happen so goddamn frequently. I'm somebody who will ignore or restrict use of resources and mechanics when I find doing so leads to a more enjoyable and challenging experience, so I can manage somewhat, but there is the idea of path of least resistance and how many players will opt to take it. It is the designer's job to prevent there from being one as much as possible. It's a little frustrating, to be honest, because they've enhanced and expanded the combat in other areas beyond the aforementioned feedback and dismemberment. Nimpo is still unremarkable and detached from the rest. I mainly use it as a clutch attack of sorts, or if there is so much shit I can't be bothered to deal with, that I'll whip out a couple of devastating spells. And the Phoenix magic is the only one that can be used on the move, but it sucks anyway, because you cannot damage enemies that just got hit by one of the birds. It's pretty lame, not gonna lie. However, Nimpo aside, there's plenty of positives to speak of. I never brought this up in the segment for Ninja Gaiden 1 because it didn't bother me enough, but the bow handled kinda poorly there in first person, and 2 fixes this. The aiming sensitivity is nicer and tweakable, there's an actual reticle, and you can zoom in for greater accuracy. I found the bow somewhat more useful as a result. Sigma 2 even lets you move in third person while shooting arrows with a controllable lock-on. It's a bit rough, admittedly, but welcome nevertheless. An optional manual hard lock-on for melee weapons and shurikens still isn't in either version, but more than ever you can seriously question if it would even be possible to keep up with. Occasional mishaps with the automated loose lock-on is probably the best they realistically could have done. I only ever felt the jank when tossing explosive shurikens from a distance or when trying to activate an obliteration technique, and in some ways it's less troublesome than before. One reason is that Ryu will do Flying Swallow regardless of enemy presence now, so if you aren't quite on the mark, at least he will still carry it out instead of substituting it with some other shitty move. It's less annoying and allows you to get a better feel for what you're doing wrong and how to correct it. And proceeding down the list of improvements, Flying Swallow doesn't strike me as too unbalanced anymore, and similarly, I found that jumping off of walls is no longer as abusable. Now, the two haven't been nerfed. In fact, you can perform Flying Swallow a couple of times in a row here without touching the ground, but it's more that enemies generally seem better at dodging or countering these shenanigans, even on the standard warrior difficulty. I also inherently didn't feel as inclined and tempted to repeat these maneuvers ad nauseum, considering how versatile Ryu has become. Parrying, for instance, is something that was in Game 1, but I didn't utilize it a lot. For the sequel, I found it more intuitive to grasp the timing of thanks to this little animation they added. It's a small detail, but as such, countering enemy attacks is a technique I incorporated into my play loads more, and it can provide some additional new crowd control due to the way Ryu dashes around in response. It's just mighty satisfying when you start pulling it off with a big success rate, and the spin attack and by extension your launch parries can now even be continued into aerial moves, opening up the door for more combo strings. In general, this is an aspect where Ninja Gaiden 2 proves to be a sizable leap forward. I already complimented the weapons in the previous installment, and most of the worthwhile ones make their return, with a respectable increase in the number of combos to their name and how those can be chained into each other. I'm keen on the air juggling stuff they added to the Vigorian Flail in particular, and there's a lot of room to flex your combo muscles with the Dragon Sword and dual katanas, especially at level 4. Those things got a saucy pool of stunts to mess around with. Moreover, half of the selection is entirely new, and there's not one tool I don't like using. The advertised Wolverine Claws have a short range but are deadly and allow Ryu to slide around. The Tonfas have an even shorter range but extremely rapid attacks with exquisite physical punch. The Kusarigama has fairly slow wind-ups but hella range and can be used to pull enemies toward you, and the Scythe is essentially the slowest heavy-duty hitter. In total, that makes for 8 reasonably distinct weapons with their own animations and repertoire of attacks. Gone are the copycats with 2 or 3 unique moves, and Sigma 2 even adds a 9th, which is the strongest by a mile and still relatively quick. Yeah, this blade is overpowered, which actually sets the tone for a lot about Sigma 2. Foreshadowing. I'm gonna be a greedy bastard though and say I do wish the weapons were set apart further in a few places. Button inputs and their outcomes can feel samey here and there. Most have the fabled Izuna drop, of course, and none of them sport any special, more unconventional properties like the unlabored flawlessness did, which would deal higher damage when you're low on health. I'd enjoy more of such features, and I'm also puzzled why switching weapons in the middle of gameplay remains absent. This was understandable for Ninja Gaiden 1, but with Devil May Cry 3 setting that standard in 2005, it is disappointing not to see it implemented here, as mid-combo swapping only could have elevated the variety and experimentation potential further. Still, it's hard to complain too much with such a wide arsenal at your fingertips, and at least the process of switching, as well as healing yourself and the like, has been streamlined slightly with a quick select menu on the D-pad. Well, it's hard to complain too much in Vanilla 2, that is. Sigma 2, on the other hand, makes a baffling detrimental change to the upgrade system. Rather than being able to level up your shit as much as you can afford, like in Vanilla 2, in Sigma 2, you can only level up one weapon of choice at a time for free at specific shops. This is just... why? Why would you make upgrading so rigid? What happens in practice is that all your essence is spent on herbs and the like, making it effortless to drip feed yourself through the adventure wholesale, and you're denied out of combat intricacies you could have had access to by this point in Vanilla 2. As if to add insult to injury, you're arbitrarily not even allowed to bring any weapon to level 3 until you reach chapter 10 out of 17. I genuinely can't think of a single reason for any of this, what it's meant to achieve. Legit, I had everything maxed out basically as soon as I obtained the last weapon in Vanilla 2, whereas in Sigma 2, I still did not by the very end, despite being absolutely stacked in yellow essence. To be fair, they do dish out all the weapons to you a little sooner, which softens the blow, and both versions allow you to use everything fully upgraded anywhere after beating the game. In Vanilla 2, there's New Game Plus, which carries over all your equipment and items. The enemies and bosses aren't any stronger here, so the challenge is totally broken, but you've already conquered that difficulty to begin with, and it's simple, mindless fun as a power trip, as well as a way to more freely mess around with Ryu's arsenal. Sigma 2 has something even better, a chapter select where you can finally replay individual chapters as you see fit. It keeps track of your ranks per difficulty, yes, and thankfully all the weapons are always maxed out too. Good shit, Ninja Gaiden is starting to catch up on this front. Now, if only the ranking system was made more robust and intricate, it still overly rewards performing ultimate techniques and now also the new obliteration techniques, so if you're gunning to achieve Master Ninja ranks across the board, then be ready to disregard like 80% of the wonderful combat in favor of doing the same actions over and over and over and over and over and over and over. It's so dumb, I don't get it. Using recovery items and dying still doesn't penalize you at all either, so the whole thing falls flat to me. Sonic Adventure 2 got it right in 2001, and that's a dang platformer of all things. I really wish the ranking system was overhauled from the ground up. It would have added immense replay value, especially when you take into account Ninja Gaiden 2 is even more combat focused than its predecessor. This already reflects in something as simple as the music. The first title certainly has its energetic pieces, but there's also a lot of atmospheric and slower, more laid-back material in there, while the sequel does have its share of that too. The overall direction leans a bit more toward bombastic. As such, the soundtrack perhaps isn't as diversified and quite as melodically memorable, but it's certainly no generic orchestra that you cannot hum or won't want to pump outside of the game at all. In its own right, the score is really high-quality stuff, worthy of praise, and the instrumentation is magnificent. It hits a certain way and sounds hype as hell when you're embodying the Master Ninja himself, you know, whooping ass and surviving the utter chaos that could end up swallowing you whole. To further accommodate the shift, progression and level design has been simplified as well. You get a bunch of linear chapters that each take place somewhere else altogether, from not Moscow to New York City and from aboard the villain's large aircraft to the depths of hell, literally. To their credit, the environmental design is, for a good chunk of it anyway, pretty nice. Ninja Gaiden 1 has its neat locations like the monastery and Tyron itself, but for every one of those there would be something fairly uninspired like some underground catacomb or cavern. 2 isn't devoid of that, no, but among others you get a huge ancient castle to explore, a jungle far removed from civilization, and I think the renditions of various real-world cities are attractive. The Tokyo landscape that kickstarts the journey especially makes a striking first impression. You even revisit the secret ninja fortress and Hayabusa village, looking richer than before thanks to the more powerful hardware. The increase in scope and detail here over what was possible on the original Xbox shines through. Vanilla 2 and Sigma 2 are obviously closer to each other in visual fidelity than Black and Sigma 1 were, but I think Sigma 2 takes the cake again with a more colorful appearance, superior lighting, and a sharper image because of its native 720p resolution instead of whatever substandard pixel count the 360 version outputs. Outside of its painfully increased load times, Sigma 2 is kind of a technical marvel, to be honest. With this streamlined approach to progression and level design though, a hub with interconnected areas and the resulting backtracking is a thing of the past. This isn't inherently positive or negative, it's a pretty subjective preference, but I do miss this component somewhat. I thought it was handled well in the first title, and it paced out the adventure with stretches to recollect yourself from combat and break up the monotony. By themselves, the stages in Ninja Gaiden 2 have also ditched that Metroidvania-esque layout where you would collect items to open previously inaccessible parts of the stage. Don't misunderstand, there are still moments of downtime and nooks and crannies to look out for upgrades and whatnot. There is exploration to be had, but the structure is more point A to point B. You can check out small diversions to the side, but you'll be back on the main path shortly. The absence of a map feature this time around sums it up really. Puzzles don't see a return at all, which, oh yeah, I'm extremely upset about, but platforming is utilized a little less as well, I want to say, and I was actually hoping they would tap into that more the second go-around. The clock tower climb in Submit or Die is probably the most extensive woohoo jumpy segment, and it's an awesome set piece. You can even lure enemies in between the two cogwheels, killing them instantly. However, in terms of actual complexity, it's nothing to really write home about. More consistently challenging and imaginative platforming is definitely something I would have liked to see, just to inject an extra spice of variety, but I should also highlight the way in which the level design has seen improvement. In Ninja Gaiden 1, combat encounters could only take place in their designated area. Enemies had to be fought where they spawn, as you would have to go through a door or something to move elsewhere, deloading the previous room. In 2, there are no rooms, if you will, and enemies are going to chase you down as far ahead or back as the stage allows. This adds a surprisingly cool layer of strategy to combat. If you're fighting a bunch of terribly aggressive ninjas in an open space, it might work better to return to that narrow cave you came from half a minute ago so they're grouped in a row and you can kill multiple with one string of attacks. If dragons in the sky are shooting fireballs at you while you're taking on already large dangerous enemies, it's probably a worthwhile idea to backtrack to the inside of the building where you can isolate the grounded enemies. If you're being bombarded by a stationary missile-spamming dickhead in the middle of a battle, notice there is a bit of an angled wall here you can sneak behind to get out of harm's way and continue your battle with the rest, etc, etc. At the same time, the plan in your head could end up not working out too well in practice and actually lead to your demise. Especially if it involves proceeding further into the level, it's often a risky business because more foes are likely to join in and swarm you. The game doesn't fucking care either. Even if the engine has to slow down to a crawl to facilitate everything, it will not buckle down and you'll have to deal with every single enemy you've called upon yourself simultaneously. I gotta say, I commend that dedication, and overall I think this is a marked improvement over the level design of the first installment. I wish the combat and environmental hazards got more opportunities to interact with each other, like how you can shoot explosive barrels to blow up targets from afar in certain sections, for example, but nevertheless I am pretty content with the level design up to about the Temple of Sacrifice. The last third of the game or so is where the chapters gradually devolve more and more into corridors littered with enemies enemies and little else. Much of the exploration and creativity fades away, and it makes the final hours kind of a slog I want to get done and over with. It approaches Final Hallway 13 territory. The combat mechanics are suitably expanded from 1, and the fact they managed to carry the endgame well speaks to how fleshed out they are, but in spite of that, burnout is certainly a problem one can experience with either release of 2. Not only is it a few hours longer on average, and 1 was already quite lengthy, I'm also willing to bet you've defeated at least 5 times the number of enemies by the time the curtain closes, and that's an estimate based on Sigma 2. So, out of every facet where Sigma 2 tinkers the most is with the enemies. I recall many spots where straight up nobody shows up even though they do in Vanilla 2, and I'm not necessarily against that. Like I said, stages feeling like they overstay their welcome somewhat is a complaint that can be leveled at this game, so cutting down on the frequency of battles, especially ones similar in setup, can alleviate this. The issue, frankly, is that it sometimes leans too far in the other direction. The Tempered Gravestone chapter is a fantastic example where there are long stretches of absolutely nothing to fight, and it leaves the level feeling eerily empty. Sigma 2 also removes any and all enemies and hazards you would run into on the water. For the combats, I get why it does so. You cannot defend yourself on the water, and Ryu's turning radius as he hops around is not the best, so it's pretty awkward fighting. The far superior approach in Vanilla 2 is always whipping out the water gun thing and tearing stuff to shreds, which literally boils down to button mashing. Not great. On the flip side, what I don't get is why Sigma 2 takes out the submerged mines, because attentive players can notice them and path themselves around them. I really don't see how they are cheap or problematic. End result though, certain on-water portions are devoid of danger entirely in Sigma 2, so they again feel pointless and out of place. I think the most ideal solution here would have been if the water combat was improved, so that no cuts had to be made and you keep the variety in encounter design that it provides in Vanilla 2. That being said, by far the most impactful change in Sigma 2 is the decreased quantity of enemies in any given scenario. Now, from the research I've done, I gathered that the 360 is faster at rendering large polygon counts than the PS3, so part of this outcome can be attributed to that. Even on the 360, it's no secret particularly busy scenes will cause the game to physically run at a slower speed, which is charming in a few select set pieces, but an unwelcome stain on the action everywhere else. Dialing back for performance reasons on PS3 is valid, but nevertheless, I'm fairly convinced a lot of it is also artistically motivated. Sigma 2 is not shy about reducing the game's difficulty in more ways than we've already discussed. Enemy compositions tend to be altered. A section where you fight a handful of the same mini-bosses in a row in Vanilla 2, for example, might now only have a group of smaller, much less threatening fiends, and up to about 10 enemies or so seems like something the PS3 should be able to handle with sufficient stability. Whatever the cause and reasoning, more importantly, Ninja Gaiden 2's mechanics were designed with the large crowds of Vanilla 2 in mind, which is most evident with the obliteration technique. When you're severely outnumbered and trying to survive a massive scuffle, gaining the ability to instantly finish off an opponent is a small step toward getting the situation more under control. This doesn't translate to Sigma 2 that well, because when the game is inherently easier already and you're up against less enemies as well, the OTs feel unbalanced and almost like a cheap shortcut to winning battles. The limbing is more inconsistent in Sigma 2 than OG2 as well, with big dragon monsters and other fiends typically losing a body part after a few slashes, whereas I recall regular human ninjas sometimes refusing to become vulnerable to OTs at all. What further widens that gap to compensate for the loss in numbers, enemies are buffed with much increased health pools, so those dudes with a low chance of getting dismembered, you can crush them into the pavement, jam a pole up their ass, squash their ballsack, they just don't give a shit. While that can make group fights harder, as probably intended, when they're by themselves it's obnoxious and ungratifying more than anything, and of course this is only exacerbated the further you climb up the difficulty settings ladder. Man, the higher difficulty modes, I am conflicted about these compared to what we saw in Black and Sigma 1, I tell ya. I should preface that I didn't play either version of 2 on Master Ninja. I was pretty full up after finishing both on Warrior and Mentor, sorry, but I can say Vanilla 2 and Sigma 2 have their own shortcomings based on Mentor alone. Ninja Gaiden 1 had such elegant difficulty modes because each successive one sported new and/or enhanced enemies that were more aggressive and dangerous in their actual behavior. For the sequel, I don't recall much getting replaced, with the exception of the common Black Spider Ninja fellas. In Sigma 2, these replacements didn't give me noticeably more grief, honestly. What did really stand out to me, however, is the aforementioned health buffs all foes receive, and the high amounts of damage you take. Grabs in particular can instantly eat away an astonishing chunk of energy. Especially in the early chapters with a relatively small bar, some attacks are on the edge of being one-hit KOs, so that's the kind of challenge you're signing up for with Sigma 2 Beyond Warrior. Certainly, I was greeted with the game over screen more frequently as a result, but I should let you know that I opted to use very minimal healing items for this playthrough. Had I not restricted myself, perhaps I still would not have died a single time, because all currency can be dumped into restorative items. Obviously, this doesn't apply to Vanilla 2 since it doesn't have that alien weapon upgrading system, and past that, Mentor in Vanilla 2 is infinitely tougher than in Sigma 2 to begin with. It's pretty transformative for the experience as a whole if you ask me. There are more enemies on the whole, and as a collective, they are the most relentless I've ever seen them so far in a Ninja Gaiden title. I was fighting for my fucking life, so many battles you can think of, and it pushed the level design and mechanics in a way I hadn't seen before. It wasn't even until now that I thought to move forward or backward in stages to gain a tactical advantage, and nowhere did the obliteration technique make as much sense as here. They were only ever a relief and felt paramount to the balance of combat encounters. There was a profound sense of satisfaction in overcoming many sections, often by the skin of my teeth. However, Mentor in Vanilla 2 is sadly also where the game's uglier side is most blatantly exposed. The whole vision that makes the game so exhilarating and addicting at its finest, the die slower than your opponent's vision, is also its downfall for me at times. With such an unrestrained design approach, you're riding a thin line where things can easily tip over into feeling haphazard or unfair, and where that line is probably a very subjective matter and dependent on player tolerance and skill as well. Unfortunately, I did find Vanilla 2 crosses that line at various moments. Not nearly always, in fact, I don't really mind the much-hated rocket launcher soldiers, for example, because they usually remain stationary and are relatively easy to track otherwise. But whenever there is a million sticky explosive shurikens getting tossed onto you, or when the devs throw more of the kitchen sink at you than you can imagine, I kinda roll my eyes. Unless you're some NG god, it's practically impossible to engage with sometimes. That is, besides railroading yourself into abusing anything that grants invincibility frames and finding ways to stay in them as much as possible. I won't deny there can be a certain thrill to that in its own right, but that also equates to a major bias towards performing Izuna drops, obliteration techniques, and ultimate techniques, as well as spamming a bunch of Nimpo over everything else, and I've ranted about that enough. Another reality is that, with action as hardcore as this, the camera can also be a bitch and pushed beyond its limits. Off-screen ambushes, mainly projectile-based ones, can be incredibly toxic. Many attacks are so powerful they will crush right through your block now, so Ryu's defense isn't as helpful anymore, and neither are the audio cues for that matter. Focusing on and placing them is a demanding task when everything is asking for your attention already, and projectiles fire so mad fast that you cannot react to them if you hear them from larger distances at all. Banning off-screen attacks would dramatically change the game, so I'm not advocating for that, but I'm missing some kind of visual indicator that warns you of enemies winding up to ambush or shoot you, and from where. This would help considerably. Think of Bayonetta 2 and how it highlights the ground under you in such situations. Enemies and the scenery itself can also physically obstruct the camera, which isn't a new issue, but the more excessive nature of 2 only makes it worse. The big demons with their wings are especially guilty when it comes to this. This could have been mitigated somewhat by rendering objects in front of the camera transparent, allowing you to still see the enemy in question, as well as what's happening in your surroundings. I hate to bring up Devil May Cry again, but remember how the pillars would go transparent when fighting Phantom? 2001. Granted, actively babysitting NG2's camera with the recenter trigger and right analog stick, particularly with quicker turning speed configured, can alleviate some of the above, but that doesn't negate the fact Team Ninja should have done a better job minimizing blindsides and obscured views. So yeah, Mentor in Vanilla 2, best described as a rollercoaster that brings out both the best and worst of the game. I'll repeat, the problems are inherent to the overall design, but they rear their ugly head on Mentor by far the most. Thanks to the more manageable difficulty of Warrior, I didn't find him to be as actively frustrating, you feel me? For the most part, Sigma 2 altogether is also on a bit of a different wavelength in this regard, and instead has its own unique issues I've already gone over. Out of the 4 playthroughs, if I had to pick one that felt the most well-rounded and balanced to me, it's Warrior in Vanilla 2, but in some, neither version quite displays the quality and finesse in their encounters on any difficulty that Ninja Gaiden 1 did. For as flawed as Ninja Gaiden 2 is, however, in reference to both releases, it's worth mentioning that it's actually surprisingly generous in some respects. It teaches the controls and mechanics way better than its predecessor, for one thing, with on-screen button prompts and optional video tutorials demonstrating techniques, and the revamped health system is quite forgiving. You see, with every hit you take, your bar will become increasingly more red on the right. When the current wave of enemies are defeated then, all of the bar that is gray up until the red will be refilled. This means you can get a decent amount of health back after overcoming a battle without resorting to any items, but you can of course use those to make more of the bar blue again, and save points now also fully heal you once when you first trigger them. Areas that you've cleared of foes will stay cleared forever too. There are no spots where enemies can respawn at all, unlike Game 1, and so as far as the stage allows it, you can always travel back to a save point to lock in any encounter progress you've booked before reaching the next save point. Call these band-aid solutions for Vanilla 2, but I can muster up more goodwill toward a game where taking damage is an intended inevitability when it's appropriately lenient with health restores and checkpoints. Lastly, there's a pre-boss fight checkpoint now, allowing you to try again instantly after dying, although Vanilla 2 does not have a post-boss fight checkpoint, which is just cruel if it's intentional, or a shockingly glaring oversight if not. Thankfully, Sigma 2 does have a post-boss fight checkpoint, so thumbs up for that. Sigma 2 also has the courtesy of removing minions from boss battles on Warrior, with like 1 or 2 exceptions, and I approve of that. They show up a bit more again on Mentor, which, fuck, but it's nothing as crazy as in Vanilla 2. There, they appear pretty frequently even on Warrior difficulty, and on Mentor, it's off the damn hook. I suppose this falls in line with the rest of the game's mentality, but how they handle bosses with minions here leans toward the bullshit side of things for me. Not only are the bosses a lot more on the offense than in Ninja Gaiden 1, so are the enemies, and there are more of them. An intricate and complex encounter like a boss just does not gel too well with distractions or an assload of explosive shurikens being thrown onto you, though there are tools available to make it somewhat more realistic and palatable. Stockpiling ki and letting loose tons of Inferno Nimpo gets you far, and in Vanilla 2 you can actually toggle the camera's focus between loose and tracking the boss. Neither are ever ideal, but you get at least some degree of control and flexibility, and it makes it sorta viable to take out minions first and then focus on the boss. A silver lining, if you will. That said, even without minions, the camera occasionally struggles to follow bosses correctly, notably when around edges of the arena. The snafu is usually fixed by refocusing a couple of times, yet those short intervals can mean life or death. Sidonius is a good example. I always use when he turns orange as a visual cue to jump out of the way of his incredibly strict crash down from midair, but if the camera at a given moment is aligned weirdly, he'll reach out of view as he launches himself, making it more difficult to dodge consistently. I will say, outside of that, Sidonius' fights are good and strong contenders for best in the game, as he's one of those that truly punishes mindlessly wailing on him. Slashing him during many of his attacks won't always cause him to flinch, enabling him to grab and beat you up badly, so you'll have to experiment and study closely what his safe punish windows are, where he will get stunned 100% of the time, and how long that stun lasts, and how much damage you can get in. Input even one button press too many by accident, and you may pay the price dearly. At first, he may seem erratically bullshit, but on his own, I think he is fair. I enjoy fighting Alexei for similar qualities. He has a lightning quick charge forward that'll grab you if it lands, and the fun of that attack is gauging if, in the moment, you should move out of the way altogether, or if you can predict where he will land, and place a dash just close enough away where you can sneak in some hits. His moveset even expands halfway or so with the ability to charge forward successively in a row, and he will use this to be cheeky and fake you out. Suffice it to say, any boss that operates akin to the above, I probably liked. While I wish he were a bit more complex, Genshin to name one, and even the spider in the first chapter is cool. I was also on board for 2 of the boss fights that revolved around the bow. They aren't terribly deep, but I would argue more than the tank and helicopter in the previous title, and they create a different sort of dynamic and pace. The last one has a hint of spectacle to it too, as you periodically have to ascend the area. When used sparingly and done decently, I welcome these for the variety alone. Unfortunately, there's also a noticeable amount of weaker or straight-up horrible bosses in Ninja Gaiden 2. In the former camp, we have something like Wolf, who's got promise since he blocks many of your attacks from the front, but once you figured out how to get behind him, most of the challenge is gone. Elizabeth is mad tricky and has an attack that can absorb your health, which nobody else can do, and I think it's interesting. Surely she would be a solid fight, if not for how so many of my fucking hits would inexplicably refuse to register. Her hitbox seems broken, and it's kinda aggravating. Still, okay enough battles, but then we get to the bottom of the barrel. Gigadeath in the tunnel with these faces and his big face it summons that I seriously cannot figure out how to dodge reliably without abusing Nimpo. The water dragon where you've only got this tiny pillar to maneuver, charge arrows and dodge a few attacks, and of course the tunnel worm thing where all you do is sit in one of these openings, charge a UT, and release when you hear the worm rushing in closer. These are simply awful, and combined with the minions nuisance, the full selection just averages out to a very mixed bag for me. Repeat bosses are common too. You face off against each of the 4 greater fiends twice, and while many of them do upgrade on the second go, Genshin is just inexcusable since you duel him 4 times, and only on the 4th go do I spot any differences. I would have been perfectly content with less bosses, you know. The worst is when they take the shitty armadillo guy and escalate it into this double armadillo hellhole later with atrocious visibility. It's dreadful, and I couldn't get past this with any considered measures. The only approach that worked was hacking away until I got lucky. Sigma 2 rightfully got rid of this abomination, and as you'd expect, in general, it adds and subtracts in the boss department. The most egregious trash, like the worm, was put on the chopping board entirely, and they replaced the multiple dragons in Chapter 9, for example, with this one dragon that's more of a traditional, albeit solid fight. There's also the new big statue boss, which is never the most compelling in concept, but I think the simplicity works well so early in the adventure. We just didn't need 3 variants of it in the span of like 2 hours is my grievance there. If you ask me, not a bad set of changes though. Really, the main fights they screwed up are the ones centered around the bow. They're fundamentally botched in Sigma 2 since arrow charging as a mechanic was removed. The bosses weren't altered to accommodate this, however, and take as much damage from a normal spammable arrow shot as a fully charged shot in Vanilla 2. You can see the problem with that. Overall, it's kind of ironic and sad that one of the most enjoyable bosses for me across both versions was the repurposed demon guy from the first game, only now you fight him as Rachel. The minions are manageable, he himself has a moderate variety in attacks and patterns and punishes greedy players, and you cannot cheese the fight with stronger weapons, which you can do for many of Ryu's bosses if you so choose. This was a highlight from Sigma 2 in my eyes, and Rachel sporting a firearm to integrate into combos together with her hammer actually makes her stand out a little more. Credit due where credit's due. Past the above though, Sigma 2's inclusion of the 3 chick chapters, again, comes across as tacky and obtrusive. Listen, Momiji is one spicy senorita. I'm a fan, and I'll let her Izuna drop me into the ground any day of the week. But she, as well as Ayane, just aren't that different from Ryu. Momiji has a double jump as a combo extender, I guess, and Ayane's rocking the explosive shurikens, which were taken away from Ryu in Sigma 2 specifically. I was confused about why before, but they couldn't have done that to arbitrarily give Ayane a unique selling point, could they? I hope not. Anyway, all 3 characters even have wall-running acrobatics, so I wonder what the point really is other than eye candy. I think I just answered my own question. They're plopped into previous stages with a few new sections stitched on, admittedly a slight step up from Sigma 1, and 2 of their 3 bosses Ryu encounters later on in Sigma 2, so those aren't even fully exclusive. There's also an argument to be made that Rachel segments in Sigma 1 at least have some degree of plot relevance with Elma, but besides Ayane's retrieval of the Eye of the Dragon, Momiji and Rachel are never even seen or mentioned in Vanilla 2, and their chapters here are totally random detours that interrupt the main story. Oh, right, I almost forgot. Ninja Gaiden 2 has a story. It's a rather shallow one. Really, it can be summed up as such. 4 greater fiends are awakened, Ryu travels across the globe to put him to bed, and ultimately he confronts the successor to the Vigor Emperor, Vazda, or however you pronounce it, after a trip through hell. To an extent, you can reduce any plot like this, but I'm not really reducing it, at least not what's present in cutscenes. You see, you can actually gather quite some lore from journals. There's humorous diaries to shift through from fallen foes, fairly extensive history about the origins of the fiends, and that's admirable. Shows they had a vision for this universe. The thing is, I don't think a game like this is necessarily suited to stopping minutes on end to read paragraphs of text that contain context. Call me a lazy bum, I guess, but I feel more of this could have been incorporated into the cutscenes because the actual material therein has a little depth and no twists of any kind. It's inoffensive, it isn't bad, just a bare-bones good versus evil tale where none of the characters seem to have compelling personal stakes or motivations, if any at all, beyond that. The 4 greater fiends, they're forgettable, can't sugarcoat it. Alexei is the least bland one since he is a creepy pervert to any female, including the Statue of Liberty.
Trapped in a cage.
Stop it.
Oh, yes. That's it, yes. Sing for me. Sing again. And again.
But Volf is running out of entertainment with his gladiator battles and seeks a worthy adversary. I actually got more of a laugh out of seeing all of his subordinates cheering and going apeshit. It just looks so goofy and silly. Zidonius views humans as ungrateful apes because he bestowed them with the gift of fire or whatever. And no joke, all I remember about Elizabeth, the queen of the greater fiends, is tits and cake covered in blood. Riveting stuff, truly, and it's a bummer. It's not as if Team Ninja doesn't have the ideas. Like Genshin, leader of the Black Spider Ninja clan and essentially your equal rival, apparently hates the dragon lineage because Mirai, who used to be a part of the Hayabusa clan in the past, killed Gamoth, and as it turns out, Gamoth was actually Genshin's younger brother. That sounds intriguing, but the only reason I am aware of this background is because I forced myself to read all of the fucking journals for the sake of review. How is this, I assume, important part of Genshin's drive not integrated into the main narrative in any fashion? He doesn't even bring it up when he has a short heart-to-heart with Ryu in his dying breath, which is admittedly a cool moment, with the two being able to relate to each other through their extreme dedication to protect and honor their clan. Now imagine how it could have been an even cooler moment if the Gamoth detail was revealed, and how that reframes Genshin in a slightly familiar light. You know, I was hoping the writers would give us more to chew on this time around, but if anything, it's less. Sure, the execution was far from stellar in Ninja Gaiden 1, however, there was the final plot twist, the whole avenging Hayabusa village setup, and Rachel, for as superficial as she was, did have a clear, empathetic reason for becoming a hunter, a reason that coincidentally gave her the shared goal with Ryu to hunt down Doku. Her replacement in 2, Sonya, might as well be a Barbie doll. The only thing I know about her is that she works for the CIA, and I'm confident that's not on me because even her character description on the Ninja Gaiden wiki is far shorter than Rachel's. It's implied Ryu has a romantic interest in Sonya in the ending, which doesn't register for me. To him, what makes Sonya different from Rachel? There's equally little chemistry and development between the two, so is he just thirsty for some and simping? You're a Chad first class, Ryu, you don't have to stoop to this level. The man himself is still a stone face as well, though he is a bit more talkative now, and I find his new actor is better. I sort of warmed up to Ryu a little here actually. Not that his character has changed substantially, but something about his dead serious and unfazed attitude creates an amusing contrast to all the wackos and absurd circumstances he encounters.
Yet your ancestors in the dragon lineage tried to extinguish that flame. Do you not think that foolish?
I don't care.
There's this event where wolves break out in Venice, tearing apart a bunch of civilians on the street, and mere seconds later, Ryu strolls around the corner, vibing like it's yet another regular day on the job as a dragon ninja. If we're not having a comedic or bold protagonist, then I can appreciate the developers showing self-awareness through what's happening around Ryu and his reaction or lack thereof. Dumb, campy shit like this and action-oriented set pieces are when the cinematics are at their most entertaining. The old blacksmith showing he still got it by single-handedly wiping out a group of Black Spider ninjas, Sonya blowing up an entire coliseum of fiends with helicopter missiles, her and Ryu escaping from a crashing airship on a motorcycle, and while I wish there were more of these elements, I'm glad they're there at all. The cutscenes boast some slick presentation too and hold up well with great voice acting, animation, English lip sync, and cinematography, so at least I can wrap up my thoughts on the story on a positive note.
Your embrace of the evil way has consumed you.
Evil. The ninja way knows neither good nor evil.
Speaking of wrapping up, we're nearing the conclusion of Gaiden 2 here, but first I should shoehorn in talk about the returning mission mode, because I couldn't figure out where else to do so. For Vanilla 2, it's actually DLC you have to buy, and it's a very lackluster pack. There's only 16 missions, a third of which are just fighting bosses from the campaign, but in a different setting, and much of the rest are undercooked enemy gauntlets. Many of the missions are jarringly short. There's only a small handful that are decently long and challenging, primarily the ones where you have to defeat 100 enemies, but it all feels cash grabby regardless. There are no new environments or foes or anything, it's all stuff from the main game, nothing new to see, and none of it is remixed or rethought in clever ways. This falls short of the mission modes in Black and Sigma 1, which had more content, were generally more interesting, and didn't cost any extra. Sigma 2's team missions, on the other hand, are pretty solid. They're all included in the base product for starters, and the number of missions has more than doubled, with a total of 35. These are divided into various difficulties, and from Mentor onwards, they certainly become quite hard. Ultimate Ninja is so ridiculous that you'll be fighting like 3 bosses simultaneously, which is brutally bullshit, but that was the intention, and I can see the value in optional bonus content that will bring even the absolute best players to their knees. Not for me though. On the face of it, the missions aren't much more exciting than Vanilla 2's, but the key difference is that Sigma 2's are co-op. You can play solo with an AI-controlled partner, but they constantly kick the bucket past warrior missions, so you really want to invite a buddy to get the most out of this. Local multiplayer is not supported, so I got Exoparadigm Gamer from Remake or Rebreak to record some footage with me, and Oh no, this is worse than Smash Ultimates Online. Yeah, so pro tip for you Zero people out there who are trying this mode on the PS3 today, make sure you're both using an Ethernet cable because it resolved nearly all the lag for us, and funnily enough, the game became more playable than Ultimates Online. How about that? It's not flawless with the input delay still, but perfectly functional. Anyway, it's pretty fun to play Ninja Gaiden together with somebody else, and there is some interactivity. If you're fast enough, you can bring each other back to life, however, the health you gain back gradually decreases, and by activating both of your Nimpos around the same time, you get this giant screen nuke that basically kills anything present at the current moment, with the exception of bosses. Naturally, bosses with minions also work now and don't feel so overwhelming, so there is a moderate amount of strategy involved there too, you know, figuring out each player's strengths and weaknesses. Long story short, the team missions aren't earth-shattering, but I appreciate them for the novelty alone, and it makes me long for the ability to play through the main campaign in co-op with different characters. Sure, it would probably be broken, but with tweaks here and there, that seems like it could have been incredibly enjoyable. Ultimately, Sigma 2 isn't some disaster. Taken by itself without context, it's a good action title for the PS3 with quite a bit of content, and it undeniably tidies up and smooths over certain aspects of Vanilla 2. For that reason, I think it's also understandable and reasonable for people to like Sigma 2 more, especially since it's very beginner-friendly. This is not a bad place to start as a Ninja Gaiden novice. By the same token, Sigma 2 makes its share of unnecessary port changes is a neutered experience overall, and as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really come into its own with a proper sense of balance. It's one man's vision layered over the foundation of somebody else's, and so by nature, it's easy to see why Sigma 2 is so controversial. With that being said, what's perhaps most disheartening to me is that it misses the opportunity to finish what wasn't properly finished. It's well documented that Vanilla 2 had a stressful, strained development, with director Tomonobu Itagaki having a fallout with the higher-ups of Koei Tecmo. This echoes through some of the lackluster to plain bad parts that crop up at various points, as well as the various glitches that can happen. Sigma 2 released 16 months later, yet it still doesn't feel super polished when it comes to weird technical hiccups, and by and large it simply cuts out the most blatantly unfinished content. None of the weaker chapters or individual sections are rebuilt or reimagined or anything, and instead the shiny new exclusive content included for the campaign is fap fodder. I would have loved for Sigma 2 to stay faithful to the spirit and direction of Vanilla 2 as best as the PS3 allowed, while bringing the needed mechanical, balancing, and level design improvements to deliver the complete, definitive Ninja Gaiden 2 package. All things considered then, which do I prefer between Sigma 2 and Vanilla 2? Well, I can only answer with the latter simply because it's the original where the mechanics and overall design work most in tandem with each other. The game is not as tight and consistent as its predecessor. Ninja Gaiden 1 has aged like fine wine. It's the perennial classic most folks can appreciate, whereas Vanilla 2 holistically is not as refined and meticulous. It's so uncompromising in its goal to be the most batshit insane entry in the genre despite a problematic development, that it can't help but periodically lay out the cracks bare in front of you. When I get screwed by some off-screen projectile for the 10th time on Mentor, or run into that shameless, abysmal dual armadillo fight, it's racing through my mind how rough and rushed some of the design can be. There's just no denying it. But yet, at the end of the day, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy myself a great deal as well. Don't get me wrong, I 100% wish the lows were ironed out, no apologism from me, but I do believe the highs outweigh the lows, and the highest highs are indeed high. Higher than Ninja Gaiden 1. The combat and feedback are in a class of their own, and all those moments when the action is coming together correctly, where you're weaving in and out of the madness surrounding you, finding chances that trim down the opposition that severely outnumbers you one by one, it is a bloody beautiful sensation. For better or worse, Ninja Gaiden 2 is truly one of a kind, and whenever it's better, it's hard not to love. Let's cut the crap and be straightforward with this one. Ninja Gaiden 3 sucks, and those words shouldn't shock anybody who's played it. It puts a larger emphasis on story than the previous installments, but fails to deliver on anything meaningful in that regard, and the gameplay itself is not only bogged down by stupid conventions found in modern gaming, it's also stripped of much of the challenge and mechanical complexity that was core to the series. Fortunately, to their credit, Team Ninja took the L, listened to the criticism, and made a genuine attempt to fix as much as they could with the re-release Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge that came out 8 months later, so as I started tackling Ninja Gaiden 3, I was most interested in finding out how well that version holds up in particular. You could argue it's almost kind of pointless then to review Vanilla 3 at all, but I think everybody enjoys riffing on some stinky trash, right? The Mega Man X6 magnum opus I did is my most popular video for a reason, and on top of that, I'd say examining the faults of Vanilla 3 first is important in forming a proper assessment of Razor's Edge. This time around, we'll start with the story, which begins with the Japanese Ministry of Self-Defense and Ryu teaming up to investigate a terrorist attack in London. This attack is led by the Regent of the Mask, and after a duel between the two, Ryu gets his right arm inflicted by the grip of murder, a curse that thrives on all the lives he has taken and will kill him once it's infected the rest of his body. Throughout, the Regent and other villains taunt Ryu with his immense body count as a dragon ninja, no, not that body count, and this is where the core theme of the narrative comes into play. Is Ryu a bloodthirsty murderer?
Hero or murderer? Which is the true face of Ryu Hayabusa?
Ninja Gaiden 3 immediately opens with this scene where he is viciously stabbing somebody to death with this scumbag villainous look on his face. It's like they're trying really hard to be edgy here, which is then shortly followed up on at the beginning of Chapter 1, where you're forced to execute one of the terrorists in London who's surrendering himself to you. Now, I don't even really know what their message is with this, but if they're trying to paint Ryu in an ambiguous light, maybe I'm a scuzzbucket too, but I don't really think they succeeded because this is a terrorist after all. Yeah, the guy is trying to feed his kid and perhaps he hasn't actually hurt any innocents yet, but other members of the group are deadass on tape shooting down civilians on the streets. If you were in Ryu's shoes, would you let somebody who is willing to become a terrorist for money in modern England where there are social security benefits and who's still a possible danger off the hook because he is sobering up now that he is on the brink of death? I suppose there is room for debate here, maybe the guy should have been locked behind bars instead, but I think it's fair to say this is the most questionable kill we see from Ryu in the entire trilogy, and it's not even that much of a condemnable one. I cannot take this direction of casting doubts over Ryu as a character seriously as a result. Fundamentally, it feels contrived and forced to me with no earnest or substantial basis. Don't get me wrong, there is merit to questioning a protagonist's actions in stories if the morality of what's being carried out is a little muddier, but it's firmly established in Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2 that Ryu is a hero fighting evil. In the second game, the entire plot is about stopping the resurrection of what's basically Satan, while Ryu was arguably more selfishly motivated in the first game. Those he is seeking revenge against are, in no uncertain terms, evil. The Vigur Empire steals the locked-away Dark Dragon Blade from the Hayabusa village, and that thing is synonymous with hatred and despair. Sure, Ryu slayed a lot of people on these missions, but they were all trying to defeat a man who is out to save the world, and they would fight him till the bitter end. And the truth is, Ninja Gaiden 3's central antagonist really isn't much better. The gist of it is that a cult of alchemists, LOA, wants to end the world in order to create a new one with their goddess, no matter the sacrifice. They are deranged lunatics because the head of R&D, Cliff, and the chairman of LOA are so extreme that they killed their family members who resisted the idea and are using the youngest, purest child, Kana, as the centerpiece of the goddess. Additionally, the game doesn't delve into deeper motives for LOA other than normal humans are insignificant and the world should be ruled by crazy scientists who can do genetic manipulation and all that jargon. Can't really wiggle this one into anything other than bad guys do bad stuff. It's funny then that the only people who really confront Ryu about his role as a murderer are LOA and two of the opponents he executes, cause their moral code is one to live by. I'm just saying, it's a little hard to put much stock in this whole subject matter this way. Surely, it would have been more effective if the characters on Ryu's side also showed a sense of discomfort and hesitation about how he carries out his missions. But no, his teammates, who are not of his upbringing, don't seem fazed in the slightest and stand fully behind him throughout. Thinking about it, it doesn't even make sense for the villains to be so on top of this either. In order to complete the goddess, LOA needs the Dragon Blade and Kana to get emotionally upset, so the terrorist attack in London was set up as a trap by LOA to have the Regent of the Mask inflict the grip of murder on Ryu, which caused the Dragon Sword to break down in structure and transmutate into Ryu's arm and eventually his body till he can no longer control it. All of this builds up to the scene where Ryu defeats the Regent. There, Cliff reveals that the man behind the mask was his brother Theodore, who wanted to stop LOA's scheme. Cliff took his brother's life to prevent that and used Theodore as a puppet for Ryu to kill in front of Kana's eyes so that she would cry and get upset as the grip of murder completes and Cliff can rip the dragon sword right out of Ryu's torso. That's odd, but whatever. My point is that if the plan was to have Ryu take out Theodore before Kana, why would the villains keep hammering on about Ryu being a black-hearted monster? In that case, they wouldn't want him to ponder about anything, right? Anyway, Kana rages and screams that Ryu is a murderer, which, I mean, sure, she is just a child, and seeing her dad fall in front of her eyes by Ryu's hands must be traumatic, but Cliff is literally revealing everything he's done in this moment, including the fact he originally killed Theodore, so it still feels weird to me for Kana to lash out at Ryu specifically, and not Cliff at all. Moreover, I highly doubt Kana would not have called Ryu a murderer if her dad was the first person he had ever taken out. Her outburst has nothing to do with his history as a dragon ninja, I suspect. What's perhaps worst of all, however, is that this should be the turn of events that lets us gain some insight into Ryu's thought process, what his beliefs are about it all. Perhaps he can reflect on his rationale about carrying out justice and reconsider it, or equally valid, stand by it, because he believes he is using violence as a necessary evil in the name of a good cause. Instead, the extent of the character examination is that Ryu mopes about for a scene because Kana called him a murderer, and once he's past that, he goes back to the battlefield as if none of that ever happened. The final nail in the coffin is that once the day has been saved, the Secretary of Japan's self-defense comes up to Ryu with the following.
You are not a murderer. You're not exactly a hero either. Guess that's what it means to be a ninja.
This is such a cop-out. It basically tells the player to stop thinking about the moral questions that have been shoved down their throat, and personally I'd say it's not even a correct assessment of Ryu in the end. I would agree, Ryu is, by the definition of murderer, probably not really one, because as far as we know, he doesn't seem to kill humans without a valid excuse. But you're not exactly a hero either? Like what? Is putting yourself on the line to save the world from its demise time and time again not an heroic act? The whole thing is just a mess. None of the stories in these 3 titles really justify questioning Ryu's ethics that much, and what's even the purpose of it if nobody reflects on the topic and if the writers quickly try to sweep it all under the rug before the credits. If this was a sincere effort to create a narrative with more depth and complexity, then I can respect that effort, but for me there's no denying that the execution is simply not there.
We're cut from the same cloth! Look at your right hand! That is the symbol of all the lives you have taken, all the people you have killed. Make no mistake, you are an assassin of the darkness. Enough!
And this also extends to other aspects of the story. As I said, the plot is an end-of-the-world thing, with a bunch of scientists with unsympathetic and generic motivation, so that's pretty bland conceptually, and what feels like half of the cutscenes are just kind of boring. There's a lot of briefings in boardrooms with the heroes discussing their plan of action for the next operation or speculating about this LOA, and events that could have been potentially interesting end up feeling predictable or plain stupid. For example, Cliff is only revealed to work for LOA 6 out of 8 chapters in, but before that, he seems to know quite a bit about them, and where normally Mizuki has always been Ryu's backup, suddenly Cliff becomes very insistent to take that job when Ryu is sent out to LOA's top secret base. Needless to say, I was expecting some kind of double cross at the base, and there it was. Then there's the part of the final chapter where it turns out Theodore survived his blow to the face from Ryu, and somehow he is the person he always used to be, even though half an hour earlier in the game, Cliff claimed that he had erased Theodore's memories. That said, Theodore says explanations can wait, so you know what, I'll roll with that, and it's kinda cool to see him on our side now and fight with us. That is, until they reach the goddess, and Theodore takes on Ryu in a duel to protect his daughter. Theodore properly dies now, so I guess a rip to our explanation for how the fuck he still had all his memories, and on top of that, his sacrifice was completely unnecessary. Ryu knows from Muramasa that the true dragon sword can only finish that which is truly evil, and since Kana is not, maybe Theodore could have been persuaded out of this, but Ryu doesn't even make an attempt to do so. And surprise surprise, Kana does indeed survive it all, so yeah. It's a shame Theodore just had to go out. I don't know why, because it would have been satisfying to see him make it after all the crap he was put through and have him reunite with Kana. He also seemed like a decent bloke with a sense of humor.
I suppose we should do introductions.
In my opinion, out of the entire cast, I think Theodore, and by extension the Regent of Damask, is probably the most entertaining character. How he physically expresses himself, the way he talks and taunts, there's charismatic, lively energy to him, and that sort of demeanor complements Ryu's more serious attitude.
Well done! As I would expect from a dragon ninja, where you go, bodies lie in your wake.
and you will join them.
The dynamic between these two is enjoyable, though when it comes to Ryu's actual personality, it's strikingly off in this game. In the previous installments, he was a man of few words, only on rare occasions could you sense a hint of emotion from him, and he was all no-nonsense and laser-focused. He seemed a bit more talkative and open in Ninja Gaiden 2 than 1, but the differences were subtle enough that both portrayals felt in line. In 3, on the other hand, Ryu is very sociable, displays clear affection for people and their personal struggles, and lets out a good amount of emotion. While I'm on board with him becoming somewhat more expressive and receptive, changing him so significantly that I swear I'm watching and listening to somebody else entirely is quite jarring. Plus, all of this change occurred off-screen between games, which only exacerbates the issue. If they pushed some development in that direction over the course of this story, then I'd be singing a different tune. But essentially throwing out Ryu's established character to the degree he is now touched to be seen as a father figure by Kana and sentimental about the idea of having a family, and that he weeps when he is called a murderer by her, I don't buy it.
And I cut him down. I killed Kana's father right in front of her. She called me a murderer.
I'll admit this much, I'm a sucker for wholesome bonding moments, so I did find the scenes where Kana and Ryu do so to be endearing, but it's not natural for them to be all close so early. If Ryu was standoffish at the beginning, gradually showed signs of becoming more receptive to Kana, and ultimately tossed that paper shuriken she made for him back at her as his way of communicating that he does care for her and will always protect her, I think their relationship would have felt more earned, rewarding, and appropriate for Ryu's character. I also don't understand the obsession with a new potential love interest in every title when the chemistry is skin deep and the woman is basically forgotten about after game's end. Granted, Mizuki is easily the best female companion thus far because she doesn't get kidnapped multiple times, only once, we're improving. She actively contributes, actually saves Ryu at one point, and since she is Kana's adoptive mother and Cliff's sister-in-law, she has very personal stakes in everything going on. She also doesn't look like she came straight out of a BDSM porno, so that helps. Nevertheless, being less shallow than Rachel and Sonya isn't exactly a high bar to clear, and while Mizuki is fine, you don't get the impression her and Ryu have this genuine click past their professional dynamic and really vibe with each other on a personal level, you know? The most authentic feeling connections are the ones Ryu has with his own clan, and I wonder why the series has always been so shy of showing and exploring these further. The chapter where you return to Hayabusa Village and fight Black Spider ninjas with Momiji is pretty neat, and seeing her and Joe come out to assist Ryu in the final chapter when the curse is taking a toll on him in the heat of battle was probably a highlight for me. I was similarly fond of the scene where Ryu runs into Muramasa in the streets of Tokyo, and you can see the mutual respect these two have built up for each other. Small stuff like that somehow sticks out more in my mind than all the hours spent with Mizuki and Kana.
Then you'd best get going. You must have faith in the Dragon Sword and yourself.
Well, that's my thoughts on the story. I don't need to elaborate any further, I think, so I guess that finally brings us to the gameplay, and the first complaint I want to address is that Ninja Gaiden 3's ambition to be deeper and more cinematic has also negatively leaked into the gameplay. Regrettably, we've got walkie-talkie segments now. Lovely. This crap is already contentious for titles with stories that don't suck balls, and I'm fairly confident nobody appreciates it when your story does suck balls. I don't get the impression these bits are cleverly arranged to disguise load times, and there's nothing about any of the dialogue that could not have been delivered without disconnecting the player from Ryu. That's essentially what's happening. Suddenly, Ryu makes a decision of his own to slow down, and the player has no other choice than to agree with it. A few of these parts are so damn long too, with your walk through the Hayabusa village being especially egregious, clocking in at 3 whole minutes. It's nice to see some of these folks and gather a sense of the overall atmosphere of Ryu's home, but it would have been nicer if you were free to do so at your own pace. Another variant of these segments are when the curse acts up. This occurs at least once every chapter and forces Ryu to tip around all out of it while often biting off surrounding foes. On paper, I am more okay with this since it's equally as much out of Ryu's control as mine, but when the theme it's meant to serve isn't executed well, all I can do is groan when I'm crawling along the ground at half a mile an hour. As far as I know, enemies cannot kill you in this state either, so it's not realistic, and during the sections where Momiji or Theodore tag along with you, they'll be there in a moment's notice and calm down the curse. What's even the point of it anymore then? It's a needless pace breaker. Of course, as a 2012 release, complementing the inclusion of walking bullshit is an abundance of quick-time events. To be honest, I don't hate these. The buttons you press are consistent in relation to what they perform in the core gameplay, so most of the time you can infer what you're supposed to press even if you turn off the prompts for them, and QTEs enable more varied spectacle while maintaining some degree of interactivity. All the same, I still feel more like a spectator with QTEs than anything, and they aren't just relegated to badass stunts. Mundane activities like climbing ropes or scaling walls, which merely required pushing up on the analog stick or pressing the jump button a few times in Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2, also needed to be converted into QTEs. It's rather tiring when they go on for a while, and getting the hang of their timing has a bit of a learning curve to it, so despite being simple and monotonous in nature, these parts may be aggravating early on. Ultimately, for a series that prided itself on mechanical complexity and consistency, it feels inappropriate to have that interrupted so frequently by something as superficial and restrictive as QTEs. They've replaced nearly all the platforming as well, and while these games never sported outstanding platforming sections, at least they were there before and you always tackle them through Ryu's core moveset. I'll still prefer that any day over alternating between two triggers. Man, there's barely speaking of level design anymore in Ninja Gaiden 3. Hidden collectibles and nooks and crannies off the beaten path are nowhere to be found, and neither are stage gimmicks or hazards. There are two blacked out caves where you slash bugs to light up the area, and that's where the creativity peaks. Beyond that, each chapter consists of kill rooms and halls where you fight regular enemies, broken up by QTEs and other set pieces like rail shooting with the bow or chase segments. Outside of some trial and error deaths you can suffer, none of these are consequential and nearly play themselves once you know what's ahead or expected of you. For instance, when you need to take down airborne enemies with the bow, all you gotta do is mash the lock-on and fire buttons because Ryu always flawlessly targets every threat around him without a hint of aiming required from you. These sorts of sections could have used more substance, but they're brief enough and they do inject some variety at least. Variety that's kind of welcome actually, because not only is the level design bland, the game overall is lacking in diversity and a slog to get through. This begins with the enemies. There are a handful of monster types, like the ones with the long arms that swing you around when they grab you, or these fiend-looking creatures that are way too dodge-happy and can explode on you when they're on the brink of death, but you run into all of these monsters less than I would have liked. It's a pleasant change of pace when you do, however, because for a lot of the journey, you are fighting human soldiers, which don't differ much from each other, besides their outfit or maybe a shield you have to knock away before you can damage them. In a sense, common mobs are the most fun guys to fight since they typically allow for the most freedom and combat experimentation, but the balance is a little off-kilter here and you just face too many of them, wave after wave, before you move on to the next segment of the stage. The human soldiers don't suicide run on your ass either, unlike the common mobs in Ninja Gaiden 2, despite obliteration of wounded foes still being a mechanic. Executing them is no longer about neutralizing a potential danger and only serves to give you an extra bout of ki for your magic meter. To be fair, the returning Black Spider ninjas do always attempt to take the Dragon Ninja down with them, but by and large, you only fight these bastards in Chapter 5. Even then, obliteration is missing much of its former crunch, considering there is no dismemberment in Ninja Gaiden 3. It's less gratifying when your opponent doesn't splice or blow apart in a puddle of delimbed blood. Also, as far as I can tell, the higher difficulties don't mix up or enhance the enemies. It was all the same shit on hard as on normal. Maybe Master Ninja and Ultimate Ninja have more on offer, but they're downloadable content that came out post-game release, and it shouldn't have to come to those to finally have more enemy variety. Believe it or not, even a few of the bosses have you taking out groups of enemies as a major part of them, as if we didn't have enough. The Black Spider Witch is the epitome of this. She is a standout moment in the game because of her sheer size, and you fight on various parts of her body, but otherwise, she is one of the most unremarkable encounters. She's got competition though, because almost half of the bosses in Ninja Gaiden 3 are more focused on being grand and visually striking. Now, I think everybody enjoys some well-orchestrated spectacle, but if you take, say, Metal Gear Rising, these parts are usually a segue to a different phase of, or a climax to the battle as a whole. Between all that resides the depth of a proper boss. These fights in Ninja Gaiden 3 are set up similarly, but are thin on the substance. They're predictable, with obviously telegraphed and simple-to-dodge attacks, filled with QTEs, and typically have like 1 or 2 checkpoints, so even if you manage to die, you're losing minimal progress. There's only so many times you can see similar looking epic shots of destroying a weak spot or whatever before they're nothing more than extravagant noise, and the battles are also pretty scripted, meaning you can only really approach them in one specific fashion. The fact that developers considered everybody's favorite, a big statue, worthy of being the final boss trips me up. They try to mask how elementary this fight is by raining down projectiles on the playfield, but it's an underwhelming conclusion to the game nonetheless. Sadly, even the more traditional, humble bosses leave something to be desired. The T-Rex is hilariously idiotic, since it always tumbles over on its own after you've dodged its charge attack. You can keep exploiting this and defeat it, and the doppelganger encounter in Chapter 6 shows promise, but in practice, it's a much less aggressive and exhilarating interpretation of the doppelganger fights in Ninja Gaiden 1. With the exception of this one strictly timed ball projectile dodge, he's a piece of cake to handle, and I don't know, the one-on-one duels overall here are kinda lackluster. They blend together a bit for me. I recall a lot of rushing in to deal damage, rushing back to dodge attacks from the opponent and letting them reveal their punish windows, and just sort of doing that on loop until I won. Sure, I take pot shots once in a while, but it wasn't sufficient to give me real trouble and have me rethink my modus operandi. It was only on hard that I had to put in some effort for the one-on-one duels. The last 2 face-offs against the Regent in particular are undoubtedly the most challenging to conquer because he will actively punish you for half-heartedly hacking away and not being observant. That said, he grabs so damn often and so quickly that surviving basically boiled down to a game of baiting him and then inflicting minuscule amounts of damage, rinse repeat. Other strategies didn't cut it, which, you know, is fine, but the Regent doesn't really have that much in the way of interesting or tough to avoid attacks outside of his grab to spice and shake things up. It started feeling more like a test of patience. Still a decent battle, but I think it sums up a lot that it's one of the best bosses in the game. You also fight the Regent on 4 separate occasions, and while the first 2 are easy and there are differences between all of them, they're too alike that it comes across as filler. Now, you might be fooled into thinking the bosses in Ninja Gaiden 3 are actually tougher than in prior entries, but if you did get that impression, it's more than likely because restorative items are cut altogether. Try beating the bosses in Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2 without using those and see if you still feel the same. Anyway, on one hand, I commend this bold cut. Taking away the crutch of healing items from every player means they can no longer drip feed themselves through difficult segments and must simply meet the demanded skill threshold to progress. Before you call me an elitist prick, I'm more so coming at this from the angle that oftentimes you'll appreciate, or despise I guess, enemy and boss design a lot more when you actually have to respect them and really learn their intricacies. On the other hand, it is a harsh omission, more so when you take into account the game was aiming to be more accessible and casual friendly. I think the more suitable compromise would have been to penalize the player with a lowered rank for utilizing items. People who never were going to care can still resort to them if they're struggling, while those who do want to dive deeper and master encounters are given an extrinsic motivation. This had been a practice in the genre for the last decade, and it's yet another reason why Ninja Gaiden could really use a dang ranking system overhaul. 3 though just yeeted the concept and doesn't have such a system at all. Oh, and buckle up, cause that's not where the act of streamlining and stripping down elements stops. Remember how the previous installment had 8 different weapons to play around with? That was pretty lit, right? Now, what if I told you that that number here has been reduced to 1, the fucking dragon sword / functionally identical blades that replace it? That's not a joke, I'm dead serious, and it's a massive disappointment. The thing has received some new combos, but lost others as far as I'm aware, so it ain't as if the developers put all they could muster into this single weapon with substantially increased potential and versatility. No, you're just that deprived of options. This makes the overabundance of human soldiers more offensive than it already was, since you can't even shake up your approach in how you take them out much. Again, an aspect where common mobs are supposed to shine. What further compounds the problem is how upgrading is handled. There's no currency whatsoever, and instead you automatically gain access to a bulk of additional moves once you reach Chapter 5. That's literally all there's to it. It's rigid as hell, yet Team Ninja failed to communicate even that. Unlike Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2, combos you cannot perform yet are not crossed or grayed out, and then once 3 arbitrarily decides you can perform them, it doesn't even inform you about it. Why? Why is this a thing? This can create such confusion in the first half of the adventure, and potentially cause players to be oblivious to their newly unlocked moves in the second half. Really, I don't think anybody would debate against vanilla NG2's upgrade system being superior in every way. It started you with a smaller list of combos for each weapon you could get accustomed to before you optionally decided to invest in expanding them, and skillful play was rewarded with more essence and thus the privilege of leveling up your gear sooner. It was easy to grasp and offered a decent amount of freedom and choice. What 3's done manages to invert these two qualities. I think that deserves a round of applause. I'd be remiss not to mention the game did receive 2 DLC weapons a month or so after its release, the Falcon's Talons and Eclipse Scythe, but if we're generous and factor them in, that's only 2 extra weapons which are recycled from the second title to boot. Eating good, we still ain't. Between the Falcon's Talons and Eclipse Scythe, I think the former is also vastly outclassed by the latter now, which is gonna make sense in a bit. So Ninja Gaiden 3 decided to remove Essence, and by extension the old ultimate techniques are no more. Part of me is fine with this. I've noted in the previous reviews that I think the implementation of essence charging was not balanced right, making UTs quite spammable and abusable, when ideally they should be something considerably more reserved. Regardless, it is a bummer they simply scrapped this unique concept rather than attempt to improve it. To compensate, however, we've got this new Steel on Bone mechanic where the camera zooms in all slick and Ryu instantly dispatches the enemy by cutting them in half, or at least that's the idea because there is no actual dismemberment. This takedown can then be chained onto other foes if the next slash of your weapon manages to connect, and so that's essentially the new dominant strategy for getting rid of enemies the most efficiently. Admittedly, keeping SOB streaks going for as long as you can is addictive in a way, but learning and mastering combos is once again disincentivized. As such, the same problem we had with UTs still exists, but it's weird now. For the most part, SOB seems to trigger at complete random whenever it feels like. This can be at the start of a combo, at the end of it, or anywhere in between. You can imagine it's initially puzzling and also inherently lame when these critical attacks happen without much rhyme or reason. When I played on hard, there were a few sections where I kept dying because SOB wasn't keen on popping off. I get the impression the odds are decreased compared to normal, but then I'd get lucky and have it do so a handful of times, and suddenly I got through with plenty of health remaining. Self-explanatory, that's dumb. However, after doing some research, it turns out there is actually a reliable method to activate SOB, sliding into an injured enemy and catching them in the air with a heavy attack. And this is not explained at all though, and if that was done to prevent players from spamming SOB, maybe don't create such an overpowered mechanic that you have to withhold information about how to purposefully take advantage of it. Now, to tie this back into the earlier point about the Falcon's Talons being outclassed, you can only chain SOBs with this weapon when the first SOB triggers randomly. If you slide into an enemy to deliberately trigger it, for whatever reason you cannot chain into another SOB. It's an incredibly bizarre exception. By contrast, you can chain SOBs from a slide trigger with the Eclipse Scythe, and since Ryu swings this hunk of a unit so widely and the second swing even counts, you're given a huge range to hit the next foe and continue. Heck, this range arguably makes the Eclipse Scythe better than the Dragon Sword even. All things considered then, I like Essence Charging and the old ultimate techniques more because you at least had full agency over whether or not and how frequently you used it. You don't with SOB, and it's really annoying when it disrupts combos against your will. Frankly, it's all too apparent that weapon variety and combos were no longer of interest to the designers in the slightest. You see, SOB alone wasn't enough because the ultimate technique has also been retooled into something else. Here, it's become this special attack that sees Ryu teleporting across the arena on a killing spree, and it's always guaranteed to take down the same amount of enemies depending on how far your weapon is upgraded. Again, I cannot help but view this as a downgrade because there is no room to screw it up like there was with the old UTs, and it's unclear to me what conditions you even need to fulfill to unleash one. A red glow on your weapon indicates the ability to do so, and I'm assuming it's related to how many enemies you've defeated, but sometimes it takes forever, while other times you'll get the red glow immediately again after Ryu's just finished a UT. It's all over the map. Lastly, Nimpo returns, and this is the worst iteration of it yet, since there's only one variant, and it's a cinematic screen nuke that goes on too long and gets repetitive fast. The spell isn't ammunition-based anymore either. Instead, you build up this key gauge for it, which I'm not necessarily against. It gives you a mini-goal to fight toward, which works surprisingly well considering activating Nimpo is also the only way to heal yourself besides owl saves. However, much like the red glow for a UT, the rules behind how this gauge fills come across as random and arbitrary. Mix all the above together and the combat can border on button mashing, where flashy finishers and spectacle have taken total precedence over complexity and substance. Call it an exaggeration, but I'd say the game isn't far off from playing itself on normal. Granted, the heat is cranked up considerably on hard and I died way more, but with the removal of restorative items and limited combat options, not to mention Steel on Bone being the unpredictable beast that it is, it's not as fun or satisfying of a challenge as you might hope. And that's where my main grievance lies. Not so much the difficulty or lack thereof, but the criminal watering down of mechanics. Sincerely, I dislike being so negative, but I'm struggling to bring up truly redeeming aspects about Ninja Gaiden 3. If it means anything, I suppose, purely on its own merits, it isn't terrible. It's a functional video game, and at a base level, it's rocking the same tight controls and quality of animation as its predecessors. That counts for something. Plus, when you're in the mood for a mindless power trip, I don't think this is the worst thing in the world to play in short bursts. In spite of that, when the third entry in the series is almost universally a step down and brings nothing new that's worthwhile to the table, it's no wonder this one is widely panned as the black sheep. Team Ninja or Koei Tecmo or whoever is to blame went in a tone-deaf direction to chase trends and cater to a broader audience, but unfortunately failed to attract that audience and alienated already existing fans. So, after the overwhelmingly negative reception rolled in, the Mad Lads set out to salvage as much as they could and aim to please fans with Razor's Edge. Now, one aspect that's obviously changed very little is the story. Rewriting and reproducing all these cutscenes in the span of half a year was simply not in the cards. They did remove those parts where you executed enemies that had surrendered to you, and similarly, the comically edgy opening where Ryu mercilessly stabs somebody to death has also been cut. A good call, I'd say, since the scenes did not contribute to Ryu's character examination in the end, and at least you don't get the impression anymore that the game is pushing some kind of narrative. As such, the morality theme of the story feels even more fruitless, but who cares when it was asked to begin with? Moving on to where the real improvements are then, the gameplay. With a few exceptions like the escapade through Hayabusa Village, most of the walking segments now allow you to run at full speed, which is much appreciated, and since there are no ill side effects that come from it, shows that this time wasting served no practical purpose in Vanilla 3. The majority of quick time events are still present, but all the rope and pole climbing is gone in favor of simple bridges connecting the two endpoints, and though the wall scaling stuff remains, the timing is more forgiving now, and if you mash the triggers, Ryu's tempo is up significantly, making these bits less bothersome. Overall, some of this boring nonsense from Vanilla 3 lingers in Razor's Edge, but I think the developers largely did what they could to get rid of it, and it's certainly better. The one exception are the moments the grip of murder consumes Ryu. Now you get warped to some kind of shadow realm where you fight hordes of enemies, with your health slowly draining. I'll take it over cutting up foes with 50 bottles of whiskey chugged down. That was active torture, but halting stage progression for more combat in a flat, featureless arena and with no new enemies or anything isn't great either. I feel like turning the curse into something advantageous to the player with a Devil Trigger form of some kind would have been the more compelling alternative. Let Ryu really tap into that dark energy that's consuming his body, like Jak could after being pumped full of Dark Eco in Jak 2, you know what I'm saying? But if not that, having the curse simply drain your health during encounters that take place in the proper level itself would have been a suitable compromise. Speaking of levels, they haven't been altered really, so they're the same standard square spaces and hallways you fight foes in as before. This is definitely an aspect where Razor's Edge still fails to measure up against Ninja Gaiden 2, which for a good chunk of the adventure had more diversity in its layouts and terrain, and also allowed you to travel back or ahead in stages to possibly gain a tactical advantage over your opponents. In Vanilla 3 and Razor's Edge, everything's always blocked off and you have to deal with enemies where they spawn. Furthermore, there is an attempt to incorporate exploration with the addition of collectibles, but that can only do so much when the level design was not built with them in mind. Either the collectibles are in plain sight, a camera spin away, or tucked in some obscure or camouflaged corner, so I would tirelessly check every square inch of each area running into and along edges of the map and whatnot to make sure I missed nothing. It's not very organic. A handful of them are hidden a bit better and less awkwardly, but they are the exception rather than the rule, I'm afraid. One collectible you can find is the Crystal Skull, which teleports you to confined, reused locations from the previous titles, where you have to survive an onslaught of opponents and face off against the past boss. These are pretty challenging and hard to complain about since they are optional, but personally I was not too excited by the prospect of yet more combat that grinds progression to a halt and engaging with a bunch of old bosses again. The karma points you receive are not worth it to me when just playing through the campaign. Golden Scarabs also make their return, granting you karma points for each one you find, and the more you get, the more upgrades unlock for you to purchase, like health bar expansions and straightforward weapon level ups with choices like in Vanilla 2, tried and true. Replacing Essence from games 1 and 2, Karma Points is the new currency in Razor's Edge, and I'm a fan of it, having good overall performance, not just how many ultimate and obliteration techniques you can spam, pay off with quicker access to more combat intricacies and other fun stuff. Often, at the end of a given encounter, you're also graded on time spent and health lost, incentivizing optimal strategy and play per battle to receive more karma points, though combo crafting is still not rewarded at all, and I don't know why Ninja Gaiden is so against that. Clearly, over the course of the trilogy, a lot of development must have gone into putting together such extensive lists of combos for every weapon, so for the games to persistently not acknowledge that, and arguably discourage the player from showing off and flexing their combo prowess, will always puzzle me. In practice then, racking up the karma still largely boils down to performing all these super moves as much as possible. Not ideal to me. Thankfully, at least there are more weapons at Ryu's disposal again. These are doled out throughout the campaign, some gated behind certain Golden Scarabs quota you need to fulfill, and while you might not get to use all of them as much on your first playthrough as a result, your Scarabs count never resets, so everything stays unlocked for purchase on any future playthroughs from the beginning, including on higher difficulties. I think that's a respectable balance, since it incentivizes exploration and prevents newcomers from being overwhelmed by a huge pool of options from the beginning. Plus, moves you cannot do yet are grayed out again, so it's all pretty much coming together like it used to. It's a breath of fresh air to have more toys to fool around with again after Vanilla 3, but the bad news is that they're all from Ninja Gaiden 2, and the Vigorian Flail and Tonfas didn't make it over. That leaves us with 6 weapons, none of which are new, compared to the 8 in Ninja Gaiden 2, half of which were new, and the other half that originated from the first installment were further fleshed out. Of course, the weapons in Razor's Edge are as fun to use as they've always been, but they aren't substantially different, and that's a bit of a letdown. Some of their properties and combos have been remixed and changed, and it's neat seeing fresh animations for these weapons in the context of Ninja Gaiden 3's original mechanics. But coming off of 2 shortly before this, I undeniably felt a lot of been there, done that. By the same token, proper Nimbo spells have returned, but all 3 of them are lifted as well. What I do like, however, is that Razor's Edge retains the key meter you need to fill, and I also think it's clever that the 3 spells need varying degrees of key. Inferno being a multiple target lock-on needing the most, Piercing Void being a narrow attack that requires aiming accuracy needing the least, and Windblades being the middle ground of those two. This dilemma is further enhanced by the fact healing items are still absent in Razor's Edge, and one of the best methods to gain back health is by hitting enemies with Nimpo. The more you hit, the more you get. It's surprisingly cool, and in addition to that, certain techniques also sip on your key meter, including the ability to shoot arrows in mid-air, teleport away out of danger with the new Sakata Surge when an enemy is about to attack you, and even exchange ki for health by meditating. If you ask me, this revamped key system is one of Razor's Edge's greatest advancements, incorporating some strategy and resource management into the mix that was lacking in prior entries. It's more compelling than Nimpo simply being ammo-based, and I think it integrates magic better into the overall combat. Another mechanic that's been smartly reworked is Steel on Bone. In Razor's Edge, SOB activates when an enemy tries to grab you with this red aura on their hands, and you counter that with a heavy attack within a brief time frame. This is a straight improvement over Vanilla 3's implementation, simply because SOB is no longer a random occurrence and doesn't interrupt your combos when you didn't ask for it, unless an enemy just so happens to go red aura as you attack. But yeah, I think countering is an inherently satisfying stunt to pull off for many people, and while you could argue SOB is not a reliable mechanic since it's out of the player's hands when an enemy goes red aura, that frankly doesn't bother me. The rules are crystal clear now, and given SOB's devastating capabilities, I don't even think it should be consistently exploitable. Dismembered foes are also more eager to go red aura, so that's worth looking out for as well. And actually, I'm completely ignoring how you can in fact bait enemies into it by meditating. The thing is, I feel conflicted about that for the reasons stated just now. On one hand, acquiring the distance and breathing room needed to meditate without being hunted down can be tricky, but especially on the lower difficulties, you can get away with it quite okay, and it's very tempting to abuse. Still, you can pretend this doesn't exist if you don't want to spam SOB, and it's no longer possible to chain onto other targets indefinitely either. 4 is the maximum cap when a weapon is fully upgraded, and I approve of this limitation. Enough to maintain the wickedness of chaining SOBs, but also some needed restraint. One tweak I'd make, however, is for the larger monsters not to have a red aura. As is, you can initiate SOB on most of them just as easily as the common mobs, and I find that ridiculous. At least, you cannot chain SOBs off of them, taking them down ends your streak, and actually, that brings me to an idea of how I would do this. Make the large monsters SOBable, but only after SOB has already been initiated from a normal-sized enemy. That way, there would always be some challenge to setting it up, and it would make for an interesting dilemma. Stop your chain with a large monster, or continue your chain with other normal foes. On the subject of enemies, Razor's Edge comes out a bit better here than Vanilla 3. Human soldiers now do suicide runs on you, meaning obliteration plays a more consistent, vital role to survival, and dismemberment is back as the cherry on top, so the inherent act of it is also as brutal and delicious as it used to and ought to be. There is slightly more enemy variety in Razor's Edge too, with the standard fiends and winged dragons being repurposed from the previous titles. I still think we could use a little more. Why not have cameo appearances from more older enemy types, like the cats from Ninja Gaiden 1 for instance. But I'm also relieved some are largely left behind as well, such as those flying dragons that shot fireballs at you in Ninja Gaiden 2. They do make an appearance in the final chapter of Razor's Edge, but mercifully, they're not remotely as prevalent. Broadly speaking, the only foes in this game that can shoot projectiles from off-screen are stationary. As such, you can feasibly keep track of and place them in your head. On the whole, I didn't have as many camera woes as in Ninja Gaiden 2. Even on Master Ninja difficulty, from what I recall, not many of my deaths had to do with blindsides or whatever. Your mileage may vary, but yeah, Master Ninja didn't feel too bullshit to me. Punishing as fuck due to the lack of restorative items, sure, and I also salute the developers for neglecting to put in minions for boss battles. In an attempt to increase the challenge on higher difficulties, Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2 had a tendency of plopping minions into into battles that didn't really feel balanced around them, which I wasn't exactly a fan of. Despite that, I'm not letting Razor's Edge off the hook either, because I do think the bosses overall have actually gotten worse compared to Vanilla 3. Basically, they've been made harder across every difficulty setting, which sounds positive on the surface, but it's kind of the opposite when the bosses are poor or questionable in design. The final encounter in Razor's Edge is infamous for how awful it is. The phase where you kill enemies to unleash the Dragon Nimpo was nothing in Vanilla 3, but now you need to kill like 3 times as many of them to fill your key gauge. The fiends you fight are also really sketchy to hit, they have a serious knack for dancing around you and dodging attacks, and all of that while you're avoiding the arms from the goddess and the bombardment of projectiles. In conjunction with a camera you can never quite position to let you oversee everything, outlasting this war of attrition came down to a lot of luck and praying for the best. What a diabolical dog show to go out on. The one-on-one duels are another major source of tedium and frustration. I'll clarify, they're not that bad on normal, but as you climb the difficulty ladder and reach Master Ninja, they can all kill you in only a small handful of hits when they, of course, might as well need 10 million to die. And getting killed is nothing short of a chore because all these fights are pretty much like the Regent in Vanilla 3. Wait for their sometimes not so easily readable save punish windows to sneak in a minuscule amount of damage and do that over and over because these bosses will take you out if you get impatient and even slightly greedy. Encounters like this that drag on and where a few minor slip-ups mark your death are more monotonous and restrictive than fun or exciting, and pretty much every one-on-one duel in Razor's Edge is like this. You can use Steel on Bone on some of these bosses to speed up the battle, but how often they go Red Aura is at the mercy of the game, and if the most effective strategy to win fights is pulling off the same counter maneuver again and again, that's not what I'd consider stellar boss design. It's a fine idea for one boss battle, but not multiple of them. The culmination of all this bullshit is when you're pitted against the Whip Chicks in Ayane's last chapter. Everything I've complained about just now applies here, but with the extra nuisance of having to handle 3 opponents. To aid you in this task, the developers implemented a toggle for this encounter specifically that switches the camera's focus between the 3 targets. However, your attack lock-on still operates independently. It's quite unintuitive to have the camera focus on one target when your character can still aim for another. On Master Ninja, this was a low point for me. Taking a previous boss and facing you off against 3 simultaneously is a lousy way of raising the stakes, and it took me an hour and a half of constant attempts to beat. To give credit where it's due, I'm glad I can say Ayane's chapters in Razor's Edge are actually pretty solid. The 2 of them are only loosely related to the overall plot, they don't really add much, so in that sense they're a bit superfluous, but I do think the cutscenes with Ayane are mildly entertaining at least. She is just a charming lady, we'll say, and being fairly young, she displays an endearing sort of abrasiveness and arrogance. Something about how these new cinematics are written and directed feels like they took themselves less seriously here than for the main story. Maybe it's just me, but I don't know, I like it.
These things just keep getting more disgusting. You don't have much time. No shit.
Ayane's stages are fully unique to her as well, which is certainly an improvement over the chick chapters in Sigma 1 and 2. Granted, the level design is no more intricate than in any of Ryu's chapters, but it's different scenery to look at all the same, and Ayane feels good to play as to boot. She can be upgraded much like Ryu with the same abilities, so you can essentially view her as your 7th weapon with the bonus of being able to toss explosive shurikens, similar to how she was in Sigma 2. For once, I didn't mind being taken away from Ryu, and with merely 8 chapters in Vanilla 3, bringing that total up to 10 makes Razor's Edge a little more of a beefy adventure. Once you finish the game, you are also free to replay every single chapter as whichever character you like. So Ryu can go through Ayane's stages, and Ayane can go through all of Ryu's. That's awesome, and not where the fun stops either, because Momiji returns from Sigma 2 as a playable character, and we've even got Kasumi from the Dead or Alive series. And they as well can be upgraded like the others with accumulated karma points and play differently enough that I'd say they're worth trying out. Again, basically view them as your 8th and 9th weapons with their own Nimpo spells. My last wish is that the 3 ladies could each wield 2 of Ryu's weapons, as is he is the most versatile with his 6, because I can tell you I would probably never select Ryu again in this mode. The animation workload would be enormous, I understand, but do a man a favor, please. Another aspect I appreciate about the chapter challenge mode is how the levels are streamlined even further, with complete removal of all the walking stuff, the Grip of Murder Hell Arena parts, and even many of the QTEs and chase segments, making for quicker and less tedious run-throughs. Nearly all the focus is on core combat, which is a godsend for replayability, doubly so when you're trying to S-rank everything. This can be an excellent way to squeeze more lasting appeal out of Razor's Edge, though it is dumb that your Golden Scarab total multiplies your final karma score. It's basically not even worth going for S-ranks until you've acquired all 50 scarabs. Whoever came up with that idea is kind of an asshole, but I digress. If you're looking for even more replay value after the chapter challenges, the arena-style missions from prior entries are here and accounted for once again. These are actually already available in Vanilla 3, albeit as DLC packs, but you can only play these missions as your custom ninja character. This motherfucker starts out super weak, has a laughable combo game with his weapons, and only grows stronger and more versatile as you gain experience points and level him up. Additionally, the upgrading path is entirely linear, with no choice in what abilities you want to unlock, and since even your weapons need to level up individually, you are likely to stick to one to power it up as much as possible in order to make it past the harder missions. I guess it's an interesting idea, but in practice I found it very limiting. This custom ninja is still in Razor's Edge, though upgrading him is handled more akin to how it is for the main characters. I think the concept works a bit better as a result, but thankfully Razor's Edge also allows you to play as the 4 main characters, which is what I prefer to do since they are more capable out of the gate and already upgraded from doing chapter challenges. Much like Sigma 2, all of the missions can be tackled in co-op online, which is always a good time, and almost necessary for the higher difficulties. I mean, whether you're playing alone or with a partner, the missions are identical, and you don't even get an AI companion when fighting solo. If that's not convincing enough, you can revive each other in co-op too, so you've just got a staggering advantage with 2 players. Missions that kicked my ass when I was by myself became a hell of a lot more manageable when I got my friend Frank from Gotta Be Frank to join me, and he'd never played Ninja Gaiden before. So yeah, this can make for an enjoyable side mode to sink your teeth into. There's over 70 missions as well, all included in the base game of Razor's Edge, so have at it. Just make sure to get somebody along for the ride. If you are not the type to work together, however, in an unexpected twist, Vanilla 3 and by extension Razor's Edge also introduced a versus mode to the series, the so-called clan battles. This is exactly what it sounds like. You pick one of 5 maps and then duke it out against your opponents through the Ninja Gaiden mechanics you know and love. You have to use your custom ninja here, which is disappointing, but at least the minimum and maximum level can be set when you create a lobby to even the playfield to your liking. That said, the mode is surprisingly fun to mess around in, finding ways to outsmart or fuck with your fellow warriors, and there are some cool layers here to mention. Arrows and shurikens are limited resources, unlike in the main game, so you gotta use them more strategically, and you can find scarabs in the arena for karma points, which can then be stolen by others when they kill you. The level design is pretty decent as well, giving you various vantage points and hiding spots to use for tactical purposes, from the rooftops you can climb onto in the Hayabusa village to the various nooks and crannies in the desert stage. This ain't no Call of Duty in terms of meat and refinement, mind you, but for an extra multiplayer activity in a largely single-player oriented title, it's more than adequate. I was only able to record 1v1 for this video, but it kept us hooked and laughing for a solid hour. I can only imagine it was even better back in the day when the online was active at all and you could find rooms of 8 people for the true chaotic experience. In conclusion, Razor's Edge is kind of a weird game to judge. Evidently, it's held back by the Ninja Gaiden 3 DNA it still carries. The story is bad, the level design is restrictive and linear, the boss fights are usually either too spectacle-driven or too repetitive and frustrating, and I haven't even brought any attention to the visuals and soundtrack throughout this review because, well, I feel ambivalent about them. Sure, the graphics from a technical perspective are great and boosted over Ninja Gaiden 2, but at the cost of have a rather fluctuating frame rate, and the environments themselves are unremarkable, I think. I quite admire the Black Narwhal level. It's a memorable setting to destroy giant warships in the middle of the ocean, but outside of that, there's nothing too imaginative about the labs of LOA or the generic jungles of Abysmo Island, you know? The soundtrack also didn't grab me. It suits the action on screen with intense guitars or orchestra, but little of the music caught my ear in a way that I felt enticed to listen outside of the game. I enjoy the piece that plays during the region fights, and the main theme, Unmasked Hero, is absolutely fantastic, but that's about it for me. There aren't that many specific tracks for stages to set a certain mood or atmosphere for them either. Instead, you'll be hearing the same stuff at various bits and parts throughout the adventure, making the score seem more like a generic collection of pieces applied without much intent or purpose compared to Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2. As a sequel to those two, you could say Razor's Edge is underwhelming as well. It doesn't really push the franchise forward in a substantial or innovative way, and has to borrow all the weapons and many of the mechanics directly from Ninja Gaiden 2 in order to match its combat. Such is the reality when you only have half a year to go back and salvage a complete misguided failure, but the fact Team Ninja managed to do so is no small feat in and of itself. You can tell they tried their damnness to do right with Razor's Edge, and the end result does not deserve to be lumped together with Vanilla 3. It's far from perfect, obviously, but I think it's worth giving a shot if you clicked with the prior entries. You may end up liking this game after all. Yes, you'll be treading a lot of familiar ground in terms of combat, but is that a deal breaker when the brutality and depth of the combat is easily the best aspect about the series? I'll leave that up to you to decide, but I generally did enjoy my time with Razor's Edge, despite its shortcomings and problematic base. It is challenging, satisfying to play, has a nice amount of content and modes, and in some ways is more polished than Vanilla 2 was. Razor's Edge feels more finished, that's for sure, with no ugly green tunnels and less of that unfair, overwhelming bullshit. To put it simply, Vanilla 2 and Razor's Edge have their own issues, and while I do prefer the former, the latter doesn't fall that far behind for me. And that, my friends, pretty much marks the end of Ninja Gaiden to this day. Razor's Edge was the last real installment, and that's certainly a bummer. Not to say I'm necessarily surprised the franchise has fallen out of popularity and lies dormant, mind you. Again, I think the characters and universe lack a strong appeal for one thing, but the first game was also exclusive to the original Xbox for a while. That library just doesn't hold as much cultural and nostalgic significance as the PlayStation 2s or GameCubes, not to mention Team Ninja and Koei Tecmo are both from Japan, where the Xbox brand altogether has never had much presence. To add on to that, Ninja Gaiden 2's lack of refinement garnered the game its share of critique at the time, and Ninja Gaiden 3 was such a blunder it damaged the IP pretty badly. Razor's Edge might have restored some faith, but by the time it left the Wii U, a console that itself flopped, it was too little too late. Finally, there was that Yaiba spin-off in 2014, which was critically panned and kind of put the nail in the coffin. Since then, Team Ninja have become most known for the Nioh titles, which commercially have been more successful, so for them it makes sense to leave Ninja Gaiden behind. We did see the release of the Ninja Gaiden Master Collection in 2021, which perhaps was a test to gauge if there's an audience, but Koei Tecmo's marketing was lackluster and it came and went with little fanfare. Who knows what the actual sales numbers are? If I were a betting man, I'd put my money on not so great. The package itself feels a little half-hearted too. The best compliment I can give it is that the ports are of good quality, at least on anything that isn't the Switch, boasting shorter load times, increased resolution up to 4K depending on the platform, and much improved performance across the board. Now, the first game is perfectly fine on Switch, I should say, but the second and third can look rather crusty and struggle to maintain 60 FPS. For those with the option, I would definitely recommend you buy the Master Collection for PC, PS4, or Xbox One instead. Port quality aside, however, the collection is simply 3 individual downloads without any new content. For what it's worth, Sigma 1 and Sigma 2 are based on their Plus variants, which originally stem from the PS Vita. Of course, the games didn't run very well on there, so I suppose it is nice to have the Plus features freed from the shackles of the Vita. These features include new costumes and gear for Sigma 1 that alter Ryu's and Rachel's stats, the Ninja Race mode for Sigma 2 where you race against the clock to finish the stage and can gain extra time by performing combos, and an easier difficulty for the campaign named Hero Mode where you turn invincible when low on health for both titles. Unfortunately, on the flip side, all the online multiplayer support has been stripped out. This means you cannot play Sigma 2's tag missions or the ninja trials in Razor's Edge with another player, and the clan battles mode has been cut from Razor's Edge completely. I understand this decision from a practical standpoint, and the missions and trials are rebalanced for solo play to be fair, but it is disappointing nevertheless that the multiplayer component can only be experienced on abandoned hardware anymore. I'd happily let that slide though if Ninja Gaiden Black and Vanilla Ninja Gaiden 2 weren't missing from the Master Collection. This is by far the most glaring omission. Reportedly, Team Ninja couldn't salvage all the source files, a problem we've heard about before from various studios, but fans speculate it could also be due to Koei Tecmo's less than stellar parting with Tomonobu Itagaki. Regardless of the reason, the most accessible release of the series does not include the original vision for the first and second games. Even if you prefer Sigma 1 and Sigma 2, that's a real loss. Less so for the former, since Black and Sigma 1 are comparable enough as I've covered, but Vanilla 2 and Sigma 2 really are different animals. Having Sigma 2 is still better than nothing, but it's a shame people are more likely to play it over Vanilla 2 by default now. Thankfully, Black and Vanilla 2 are part of the backwards compatibility program for Xbox One and Series consoles at least, so they're preserved to some extent. It's an amazing effort from Microsoft, quite frankly. The emulation is absolutely flawless, giving a 2x, 3x, or 4x boost in resolution depending on the game and system you're using, and the frame rate is super stable. Ninja Gaiden 2 in particular benefits from this majorly, as all the slowdown induced by the limitations of the 360 hardware is wiped away. Even the staircase sequence is not enough to cause any hiccups, so in that sense, Xbox BC is pretty transformative. It's the definitive way to enjoy Black and Vanilla 2 without question. All that being said, whether you're wanting to revisit 3D Ninja Gaiden or explore it for the first time, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor if you're into the action genre. The first entry especially is just a well-rounded adventure, and excluding Vanilla 3, I believe all the main installments do hold up overall and stand out today. Their emphasis on visceral, efficient killing over being stylish, along with that brutal enemy AI, provides a unique take on combat we honestly have yet to see since. The difficulty can be daunting, so for that reason it won't be everyone's cup of tea, but those who learn and persevere will find rewarding gameplay. The series is undeniably flawed in many respects, yet it will always have dedicated fans who celebrate its achievements, and a revival or reboot or whatever that highlights those achievements while learning from past mistakes could be what's needed to restore its former glory. Therefore, I foolishly hope one day we'll get a Ninja Gaiden 4 that matches the quality of Devil May Cry 5. There is serious potential left here to be unlocked, and I think our hero Ryu Hayabusa deserves to be in the collective consciousness of the gaming community once again.